Here is the detailed outline designed for a 21,000-word script divided into 15 segments of exactly 1,400 words each to ensure continuous escalating tension and a satisfying narrative flow. Segment 1 focuses on the sunburned intrusion, where the parents skip the funeral and demand $50,000 from the grieving widow. 1,400 words. Segment 2 covers the severed lifeline as the protagonist cancels their credit cards and the father threatens legal action. 1,400 words. Segment 3 introduces the white sister-in-law who ambushes the protagonist at work with a public performance of fake tears. 1,400 words. Segment 4 escalates into public humiliation when the brothers' illegal gambling fraud is revealed in the corporate lobby. 1,400 words. Segment 5 uncovers Protocol Vanguard with the estate attorney revealing the hidden commercial real estate investments. 1,400 words. Segment 6 details the blind trust that owns the family's office building and warehouses, giving the protagonist ultimate leverage. 1,400 words. Segment 7 explores the smear campaign launched by the toxic family online, using tragic photos to solicit donations. 1,400 words. Segment 8 shows the protagonist ignoring the harassment to draft eviction notices and emergency board meeting summons. 1,400 words. Segment 9 centers on the cemetery trap, where the family stages fake photos over the graves and confronts the protagonist. 1,400 words. Segment 10 reveals the father's embezzlement confession captured perfectly on a hidden digital voice recorder. 1,400 words. Segment 11 sets up the boardroom massacre with forensic accountants, senior partners, and police waiting in silence. 1,400 words. Segment 12 executes the absolute takedown as the father is arrested and the brother discovers his warehouses are padlocked by federal marshals. 1,400 words. Segment 13 features the sister-in-law pleading and betraying her husband to save herself, only to be thrown out onto the street. 1,400 words. Segment 14 wraps up the immediate legal fallout, bankruptcy, and complete ruin of the toxic family members. 1,400 words. Segment 15 concludes with the closed gate as the mother begs for shelter in the rain, but is turned away, leaving the protagonist in profound peace. 1,400 words. My parents skipped my husband and 6-year-old daughter's funeral, calling it a trivial event, not worth attending all, so they could sip cocktails on a beach in St. Bart's with my brother's family. 2 weeks later, they barged into my house with fresh sunburns and demanded $50,000 from my dead husband's life insurance. They thought they could walk all over a grieving widow. Their faces turned pale when I showed them exactly what my husband left behind. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to cut toxic family out of your life for good. My name is Kendra. I am 35 years old, working as a corporate brand strategist here in Atlanta. Up until 2 weeks ago, I had a beautiful, loud, chaotic life that I loved with every fiber of my being. My husband Jamal was my absolute anchor. He was brilliant, driven, and loved me with a fierce, unwavering loyalty that I had never experienced growing up in my own household. Our 6-year-old daughter Zuri was the center of our universe, a bright, energetic little girl who had Jamal's captivating brown eyes and my stubborn chin. Her colorful crayon drawings still covered the refrigerator door, and her small shoes were still lined up perfectly by the entryway. But all of that future was violently stolen from me on a rainy Tuesday evening. A drunk driver ran a red light at 80 miles per hour, and in a fraction of a second, my entire world was wiped out. The silence that followed their sudden deaths was a heavy, suffocating blanket that draped over every single inch of our home. I spent 14 days moving like an empty shell through the hallways, surrounded by wilting sympathy lilies that filled the air with the sickly sweet smell of decay. The grief was so absolute, it felt like a physical weight crushing my lungs, preventing me from taking a full breath. I barely ate, I barely slept. I just existed in a waking nightmare, waiting to hear Jamal's keys in the door or Zuri's footsteps on the stairs, knowing they would never come. I was standing in the center of the living room, staring blankly at a framed photograph of Jamal and Zuri, laughing at the downtown aquarium, when the front door swung open without so much as a polite knock. The sudden jarring noise made me flinch. In walked my father Calvin, followed closely by my mother Brenda and my older brother Trey. They brought the loud, entitled, chaotic energy of a tropical vacation straight into my house of mourning. Their skin was glowing with deep, fresh sunburns. They were wearing breezy, expensive resort wear, looking as though they had just stepped off a luxury yacht in the Caribbean. The smell of coconut sunscreen and sea salt radiated off them, completely battling with the scent of the dying lilies in the room. There were no hushed tones. There were no soft approaches. There were no open arms offering comfort to a woman who had just buried her entire family in the cold ground. Instead, my father marched straight past the memorial candles flickering silently on the mantel. He pulled a printed bank statement from his pristine leather portfolio and tossed it carelessly onto my glass coffee table. The paper landed right next to Zuri's favorite stuffed bear. "We need $50,000 from Jamal's life insurance by Friday," my father demanded. His deep, booming voice echoed through the quiet house, carrying the exact same absolute authority he had always used to control our household growing up. It was not a gentle request. It was a firm expectation. I stared at the paper, my brain struggling to process the sheer, unadulterated audacity of the moment. I looked from the bank statement up to my father's face, then to my mother, who was casually adjusting her designer sunglasses on top of her head, as if we were discussing the weather. My brother Trey stood slightly behind them, scrolling through his phone, looking completely unbothered by the shrine of my dead husband and child surrounding him. The numbness that had paralyzed my body for 2 weeks suddenly shattered. It was instantly replaced by a cold, rising tide of pure disbelief and absolute rage. "You need $50,000, I repeated, my voice barely a whisper as it trembled with suppressed emotion. "You skipped your own granddaughter's funeral. You skipped your son-in-law's funeral. You did not call. You did not text. You did not show up. And now you are standing in my living room demanding money." My mother sighed heavily, an exaggerated sound of profound annoyance that I had heard 1,000,000 times throughout my childhood whenever I dared to express an emotion that inconvenienced her. "Do not be so dramatic, Kendra," she said, crossing her arms over her silk blouse. "We had non-refundable first-class tickets to St. Bart's. A burial is a trivial event not worth attending. It is just throwing dirt in the ground. Life goes on." A trivial event. Those words hit me like a physical blow to the chest, completely stealing the breath from my lungs. They had gone to an exclusive beach club. They had drank expensive cocktails and posted smiling sunset pictures on social media, while I stood in the freezing, pouring rain, watching 2 caskets being lowered into the wet earth. I had stood there completely alone, shaking and weeping, while my own parents decided a luxury vacation was more important than holding their daughter as her entire world ended. But this was exactly how it had always been. Trey was the golden child, the son who could do no wrong, while I was merely an afterthought, an accessory required to uphold the family's perfect image. When Trey failed, they bailed him out without hesitation. When I succeeded, they quickly claimed the credit. And anyway, my mother continued waving her manicured hand toward my brother. "Trey's logistics company is expanding. He needs a cash injection immediately to secure a new fleet of delivery trucks. Family invests in Family Kendra. It is time for you to do your part and support your brother." I looked at Trey. He finally looked up from his phone, flashing a smug, entitled smile that made my blood boil. "Jamal owed me that capital." Trey said, his tone dripping with arrogance. "We had a firm verbal agreement before the crash. He was going to invest in my expansion. So really, you are just honoring his final wishes by handing over the cash." The absolute sickness of their lies was suffocating. Jamal despised Trey. My husband knew exactly how toxic and parasitic my family was. Jamal had spent years holding me while I cried, watching my father drain my college fund to bail out Trey's first disastrous business venture, a luxury car rental service, that went bankrupt in less than 6 months. Then came the restaurant that failed in a year. Jamal would never have given Trey a single dime, and they all knew it perfectly well. They were simply preying on what they assumed was a broken, vulnerable widow who would easily bend to their demands just to keep the peace. I did not scream. I did not cry. The tears I had been shedding for 14 days dried up instantly, replaced by a burning, unyielding clarity. I slowly reached down and picked up the bank statement from the coffee table. Looking my father dead in the eye, I deliberately ripped the thick paper straight down the middle, then ripped it again, letting the torn pieces flutter onto the floor. "There is no money for you," I said, my voice steady and cold. "And while we are on the subject of money, I permanently canceled the supplementary credit card Jamal and I generously let you use for emergencies. You are completely cut off." My mother gasped, immediately grabbing her phone to check her banking app. Trey's face contorted with intense rage. He lunged forward violently, kicking a vase of sympathy flowers. The crystal shattered across the hardwood floor, sending water and broken stems flying everywhere. "You selfish, ungrateful brat," Trey screamed, his fists clenched tight at his sides. "You are stealing my future." My father grabbed Trey's arm, pulling him back, but his own face was dark with pure fury. "Get out of my house," I commanded, pointing a steady finger toward the front door. As my father reached the entryway, he turned back, his eyes narrowing into a vicious, calculating glare. He took a heavy step back into my personal space, towering over me, using his physical presence to block my exit. "You will regret this, little girl," he sneered, his voice dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper. Jamal signed a promissory note for Trey's business just days before he died. "We are taking you to court, and we will freeze every single dime of that insurance money until you are left with absolutely nothing." My father took another deliberate step forward, closing the distance between us, until he was close enough that I could smell the expensive aged rum and stale airline coffee lingering on his breath. His broad chest expanded, and the air in my living room seemed to instantly evaporate. For 35 years, that exact physical shift was my cue to shrink. Calvin Williams did not just speak, he projected. He used his voice like a blunt instrument, a booming baritone that had commanded corporate boardrooms and terrorized our household for decades. He expected me to lower my eyes. He expected me to apologize for my tone, to scramble for my checkbook just to buy back a fraction of his approval. He expected the dutiful scapegoat daughter to absorb the blow and immediately fix his problem. But I simply looked up at him, maintaining absolute, unbroken eye contact. The spell was permanently broken. The man standing in front of me was not a towering figure of divine authority. He was just a greedy, sunburned opportunist, trying to shake down his grieving daughter while her husband's ashes were barely cold. "You listen to me, Kendra," he thundered the walls of the living room, practically vibrating with the force of his engineered anger. "We are your family. We are the only blood you have left in this world. You are acting completely irrational right now. Your grief is making you hysterical. You are going to write that check today because we do not have time to play these childish emotional games. The wire transfer needs to clear my account by Friday morning, or your brother loses his competitive edge." Before I could even process the sheer clinical coldness of his demand, Trey stepped around our mother. My older brother always possessed a special kind of cowardly arrogance. He only ever raised his voice when our father was standing right next to him, acting as a human shield. Trey pointed a manicured finger at my face, his heavy gold designer watch catching the muted light from the window. "Jamal owed me that capital," Trey yelled, his voice cracking slightly with frantic desperation. "We had a firm verbal agreement before the crash. We sat down at a dinner last month, and he explicitly promised to fund the expansion of my logistics company. It was a joint venture, Kendra. A guaranteed partnership. So really, you are just honoring his final wishes by handing over the cash. You are legally obligated to fund my business. You cannot hoard the family wealth just because you are upset." The absolute sickness of his lie was so profound it physically repulsed me. My brilliant, fiercely protective husband despised Trey, Jamal knew exactly how toxic and parasitic my family was. He had spent years holding me while I cried, wiping away my tears after every family holiday, where I was treated like an unwanted guest. The idea that Jamal would secretly bypass me to invest $50,000 into Trey's failing business was not just a lie, it was a desperate insult to my husband's memory. They were simply preying on what they assumed was a broken, vulnerable widow who would easily bend to their demands just to keep the peace. I cut right through their shouting, my voice dangerously calm and perfectly level. Jamal did not owe you anything. Trey, I said, staring directly into my brother's panicked eyes. My husband built his wealth through relentless hard work and strategic intelligence. He did not throw his money into a black hole. And you are a black hole. Just like I did not owe you my college fund when Dad completely drained it to bail out your very first failed startup 10 years ago. My mother gasped, clutching the collar of her silk blouse, but I refused to stop. The floodgates were open, and 20 years of suppressed truth poured out of me. You remember that, right? Dad, I continued, keeping my gaze locked on my father. I worked 3 jobs in high school to secure my admission. I earned my spot. And you walked into the bank with a fake power of attorney and drained the entire account. I remember the exact day the teller told me the money was gone. I was standing in the student union, holding an unpaid tuition bill, while Trey was posting pictures of a leased fleet of luxury cars that were repossessed a season later. You stole my future to fund his delusion. You have spent your entire life sacrificing my stability to cover for his incompetence. But Jamal was not your safety net. He saw right through the expensive suits and the country club memberships. He knew you were drowning in debt, and he specifically warned me to never let you touch our accounts. I am not the naive 20-year-old girl you robbed anymore. How dare you speak to us this way? Brenda shrieked, stepping forward, her designer sunglasses slipping down her forehead. After everything we have done for you, after we flew all the way back here to support you. You flew back here because you are broke, Mom, I replied smoothly. And since we are on the subject of finances, I have an update regarding your lifestyle. I walked over to the entryway console table, picked up a pair of heavy brass scissors, and turned back to face them. You know that supplementary Platinum American Express card Jamal and I generously let you hold on to for medical emergencies, I asked. The one you swore you would only use if someone was in the hospital. Brenda's face suddenly went entirely slack. Her hand shot to her designer handbag, gripping the leather strap with white knuckles. You put a $3,000 Chanel dress on that emergency card 2 days after my daughter died. Mom, I stated, clearly enunciating every single syllable. I saw the pending charge. You bought a dress to wear to a beach club while I was picking out a child-sized casket. The fraud department asked if my card was stolen, and I told them yes, because taking money from a grieving mother to fund a vacation is the absolute definition of theft. I permanently canceled it yesterday. You are entirely cut off. Your limitless funding is dead. Do not try to swipe it for your valet parking on the way out because it will decline. A deafening silence slammed into the room. For a split second, nobody moved. Then Brenda frantically dug into her handbag, ripping out her smartphone. Her manicured thumbs tapped aggressively against the screen as she logged into her banking application. I watched the exact second reality hit her. Her jaw dropped open, and she let out a sharp, strangled gasp. Calvin, she choked out, turning her phone screen toward him. The account is frozen. The entire credit line is gone. It says account closed by primary cardholder. You vindictive little piece of trash. Trey snarled, his face turning an ugly shade of mottled red. The facade of the grieving, supportive brother completely vanished, instantly replaced by raw, violent entitlement. His sense of ownership was so deeply ingrained that he genuinely believed physical intimidation would work on me. He had used it his entire life, throwing tantrums whenever he was denied his prize. He lunged forward, his hands curling into fists, his face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He closed the distance between us in 2 rapid, terrifying strides. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I simply stood my ground, anchoring my feet to the floor, refusing to let him see an ounce of fear. As Trey swung his arm wildly toward me, aiming to grab my shoulders, his elbow caught the massive crystal vase resting on the edge of the console table. The vase had been delivered that morning, filled with 3 dozen white sympathy roses from my corporate executive team. The heavy crystal crashed onto the hardwood floor, shattering into hundreds of jagged, razor-sharp pieces. Freezing cold water exploded across the room, soaking the bottoms of my slacks and splashing onto Trey's expensive leather loafers. The white roses scattered across the ruined floor, looking like broken casualties of a war they had absolutely no part in. The violent sound of the shattering glass seemed to snap my father back to his senses. Calvin grabbed Trey by the collar of his linen shirt, yanking him backward with brutal force. "Get a hold of yourself," Calvin barked, shoving Trey toward the front door. "We are leaving." My mother was already retreating, scrambling toward the door with her head bowed. She carefully stepped over the broken glass and crushed roses, her eyes darting nervously around the room. She looked utterly terrified, not of the broken glass, but of the sudden shift in power. The scapegoat daughter they had pushed around for 3 decades was gone forever, replaced by a woman who held the keys to their financial survival and absolutely refused to unlock the door. Calvin paused in the open doorway. The humid Atlanta air poured into the living room, rustling the edges of the ripped bank statements still lying on the floor. He slowly turned his head to look at me one final time. There was no fatherly affection left in his expression. There was only the cold, calculating glare of a cornered predator realizing his prey had laid a trap. "You will regret this, little girl." Calvin sneered, his booming voice dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper that sent a sudden chill straight down my spine. "You think you hold all the cards because you canceled a piece of plastic, but you do not know everything." Jamal signed a legally binding promissory note for Trey's logistics business just 3 days before his accident. He guaranteed that capital with his own corporate assets. "We already have the paperwork filed with the estate attorneys. So keep your money for now, Kendra. Hold on to your little moral high ground while you still can. We are taking you to court, and we will freeze every single dime of that life insurance payout. We will tie up your bank accounts, your property, and your investments until you cannot even afford to keep the lights on in this house. You will be left with absolutely nothing." The heavy oak door slammed shut, severing my father's final threat from the sanctuary of my home. The silence returned, but the suffocating weight of grief had been entirely burned away by a sudden razor-sharp focus. I spent the next 72 hours completely numb to sorrow, channeling every ounce of my energy into a meticulous cold preparation. I boxed up Jamal's office. I forwarded his final emails to his estate attorney. I scheduled the meetings that would systematically dismantle the false reality my family had constructed. 3 days later, I stepped out of my car and looked up at the towering glass facade of my corporate firm. I was wearing my armor, a sharp, custom-tailored black suit, hair pulled back into a severe bun, and dark sunglasses shielding my bloodshot eyes from the harsh morning sun. I walked through the revolving doors into the expansive marble lobby, the familiar sounds of clicking heels and low professional chatter washing over me. I was the director of brand strategy, a woman who controlled narratives for Fortune 500 companies. I knew exactly how to present an impenetrable front. But the moment I scanned my badge at the security turnstile, a loud, piercing sob echoed across the cavernous lobby. "Kendra, please, you have to listen to me. Have to." I froze. Stepping out from behind a marble pillar was Madison Trey's wife. She was wearing a beige cashmere sweater and perfectly smudged mascara, her blonde hair arranged in an artfully disheveled mess. Madison had always possessed a terrifying predatory talent for performing victimhood. She knew exactly how to weaponize her fragility, and she had chosen the busiest time of the morning, in front of dozens of my colleagues and corporate executives, to execute her strike. She ran toward me, her heels clacking loudly against the polished floor, completely ignoring the startled looks of the executives stepping out of the elevator banks. She threw her hands up to her face, unleashing a theatrical, breathless wail that commanded the attention of every single person within a 100-foot radius. "Kendra, you cannot do this to us!" Madison cried out, her voice cracking with manufactured desperation. She stopped just inches from me, clutching her designer handbag against her chest, as if protecting herself from a physical attack. Trey is losing his mind. He is having panic attacks in the bathroom. You cannot just cut off our funding and leave us to starve. We are family. I stood completely motionless, my hands resting loosely at my sides. I could feel the eyes of my coworkers burning into the back of my neck. Whispers started to ripple through the crowd. This was Madison's strategy. She wanted to provoke me. She wanted the grieving, angry black woman to lose her temper in a corporate lobby, securing my reputation as the aggressor, while she played the innocent, helpless casualty. "Keep your voice down, Madison," I said, my tone flat and strictly professional. "This is my place of work. We have absolutely nothing to discuss." "We have everything to discuss," she screamed, amplifying her volume to ensure the junior analyst near the coffee kiosk heard every single word. She squeezed her eyes shut, forcing a fresh stream of tears down her pale cheeks. "You are hoarding generational wealth while your own brother is facing complete financial ruin. Trey told me what you did. He told me you canceled the cards and threatened to keep all of Jamal's life insurance money for yourself. How can you be so greedy? Zuri is gone. Jamal is gone. You do not need all that money. You are just punishing Trey because he is trying to build a legacy." The sheer depravity of her words, using my dead 6-year-old daughter's name as a negotiation tactic, triggered a cold, heavy block of ice in my stomach. I did not raise my voice. I did not give her the satisfaction of a visible reaction. "Madison, you need to leave," I commanded, locking my eyes onto hers. "Right now." But Madison was entirely committed to her performance. She took a step back, throwing her arms wide open, pivoting to ensure the growing crowd of onlookers caught the full scope of her distress. "I know why you are doing this," Madison wailed, her voice echoing off the glass walls. She pointed a trembling finger at my chest. "You have always hated me. From the day Trey brought me home, you despised me because I am white, because I do not fit into your perfect, curated black family image. You always looked down on me, and now you are using your dead husband's money to starve us out of spite. You are a bitter, cruel woman punishing us for your own tragedy." The lobby went dead silent. The baristas stopped making coffee. The security guards near the front desk stood at attention, unsure of how to proceed. Madison stood there, chest-heaving, tears streaming down her face, looking like a cornered animal pleading for salvation from a ruthless predator. It was a masterclass in manipulation, utilizing every social dynamic available to cast herself as the martyr. She expected me to yell. She expected me to defend myself against the accusations of racism and greed. She expected a loud, messy confrontation that she could record and report back to Calvin and Brenda as proof of my instability. Instead, I slowly raised my right hand. I made a simple, sharp gesture toward Marcus, the head of building security, who had been watching the exchange with growing alarm. Marcus immediately tapped his radio and began walking briskly toward us, flanked by 2 other uniformed guards. Madison's eyes darted toward the approaching guards, a flicker of genuine confusion breaking through her theatrical grief. "What are you doing?" she stammered, her voice dropping an octave. "You cannot throw me out. I am your sister-in-law." I stepped forward, completely invading her personal space. I leaned in so close that I could smell the expensive lavender perfume she bathed in. The crowd could no longer hear my words. They were meant exclusively for her. "I do not care about your race, Madison," I whispered, my voice carrying the lethal razor-sharp edge of a scalpel. "I do not care about your fabricated victim complex, and I certainly do not care about Trey's pathetic attempts to build a legacy with funds he did not earn." Madison tried to take a step back, but I mirrored her movement, keeping her locked in place by the sheer intensity of my gaze. "I care." I continued my words, hitting her like physical strikes. "That exactly 6 days ago, while I was standing in the pouring rain, picking out a burial plot for my husband, you walked into a boutique in St. Bart's. I care that you picked out a stunning white lace Chanel dress. And I care that you swiped Jamal's emergency American Express card to pay the $3,000 bill." Madison's breath hitched. The manufactured tears stopped flowing instantly. Her mouth fell open, but no sound came out. "I saw the transaction logs before I canceled the account. I whispered, my eyes burning into hers. I know you wore a dress bought with my dead husband's money to drink champagne at a beach club while his casket was being lowered into the ground. You are not starving Madison. You are a parasite, and your host has officially died. The blood drained completely from Madison's face. Her pale skin turned a sickly, translucent shade of gray. The trembling in her hands was no longer a performance. It was sheer, unadulterated panic. She realized in that exact fraction of a second that I held every single receipt and that her entire luxurious lifestyle was actively burning to the ground. Marcus and the security guards arrived, stepping between us. "Is there a problem here, Ms. Vanguard?" Marcus asked, his hand hovering near his radio. "This woman is trespassing," I said, stepping back and smoothing the lapels of my jacket, my voice returning to its normal projecting volume. "She has no business in this building. Please escort her off the premises immediately. If she resists, call the police and press charges for public disturbance." "No. Wait. Kendra, please," Madison stammered, dropping the volume of her voice completely. The hysterical weeping was entirely gone, replaced by a pathetic, frantic begging. She reached out, trying to grab my sleeve, but Marcus swiftly intercepted her arm. "Ma'am, you need to come with us right now," Marcus ordered, his tone leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. "You cannot do this. Trey owes people money. Dangerous people. Kendra, you do not understand what is happening," Madison pleaded, dragging her heels as the two guards firmly gripped her arms and began marching her toward the revolving doors. "We need that life insurance money. We will lose the house. Kendra." I turned my back on her before she even reached the exit. I did not watch her get shoved out onto the busy downtown sidewalk. I did not look at my colleagues, who quickly averted their eyes and scurried onto their elevators, eager to avoid my gaze. I simply adjusted my briefcase, swiped my badge at the turnstile, and walked toward the executive elevator bank with my head held high. The adrenaline that had been surging through my veins slowly began to recede, leaving behind a cold, mechanical focus. The lobby ambush was just the beginning. It was a sloppy, desperate move from a family realizing their primary source of stolen income had been severed. They were panicking, throwing everything at the wall to see what would stick. I rode the elevator up to the 30th floor, stepping out onto the plush carpet of the executive suite. The quiet hum of the marketing department was a stark contrast to the chaotic scene downstairs. My assistant, a sharp young woman named Chloe, handed me my morning coffee with a sympathetic, albeit cautious smile. I thanked her, walked into my corner office, and closed the heavy glass door behind me. I walked over to my desk, fully intending to dive into my morning emails and bury myself in brand analytics to block out the lingering scent of Madison's lavender perfume. But as I set my briefcase down, I stopped. Resting perfectly in the dead center of my keyboard was a thick black envelope. It had no postage, no return address. It was a hand-delivered certified letter sealed with a dark crimson wax stamp bearing the insignia of Sterling and Associates, Jamal's personal estate attorneys. My hands trembled slightly as I picked it up. I broke the wax seal and pulled out the heavy cream-colored cardstock. The letter was dated the day of his death. I unfolded the paper, my eyes scanning the crisp typed font. There were no pleasantries. There was no gentle introduction. The opening line stood out in bold black ink. "Kendra, if they come for the money, it is time to trigger Protocol Vanguard." The words on the heavy cardstock stared back at me in Jamal's unmistakable sharp handwriting. "Kendra, if they come for the money, it is time to trigger Protocol Vanguard." My breath caught in my throat. I traced the ink with my fingertip, feeling a sudden, overwhelming surge of connection to the man I had just buried. Even from the grave, Jamal was still protecting me. He had always known my family better than I wanted to admit. He saw past my father's tailored suits and country club memberships, recognizing the predatory greed that drove every decision Calvin Williams ever made. I did not waste a single second. I folded the letter, slid it into my blazer pocket, and walked straight out of my corner office. The drive to the financial district was a blur of gray skies and brake lights. I pulled into the underground parking garage of Sterling and Associates, a boutique estate law firm known for handling the most complex private trusts in Atlanta. Richard Sterling was expecting me. He stood waiting in the doorway of his expansive glass-walled office. Richard was a formidable man in his 60s with sharp eyes and an absolutely unshakable demeanor. He had been Jamal's closest confidant and legal strategist for over a decade. Richard did not offer me a pitying hug or a sad tilt of his head. He gestured for me to take the leather chair opposite his desk and immediately locked the door. Jamal told me this day would come, Richard said, taking his seat and folding his hands precisely on the immaculate desktop. He hoped we would not have to open these files for another 40 years. But he left explicit instructions on how to proceed if your family attempted to raid the estate while you were grieving. My father demanded $50,000 this morning, I stated, keeping my voice completely devoid of emotion. He claimed Jamal signed a promissory note for Trey's logistics business. He threatened to freeze the life insurance payout and drag me through probate court until I am bankrupt. Richard let out a dark, humorless laugh that echoed off the glass walls. He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a massive black leather binder, setting it down with a heavy thud between us. "Your father is a deeply arrogant man," Kendra Richard said, tapping the cover of the binder. "And arrogance breeds profound stupidity. Let Calvin spend his money filing frivolous injunctions against the life insurance policy. That policy is nothing but a decoy. It is a shiny object Jamal deliberately left visible so your father and your brother would focus all their attention on it like starving dogs fighting over a bone. The real wealth is entirely out of their reach, and it has been for years." I stared at the thick binder, my mind racing. "What do you mean a decoy?" I asked, gripping the armrests of my chair. "Jamal and I built a comfortable life, but we were not hiding millions in offshore accounts." "You were not hiding it," Richard corrected smoothly. "Jamal was building a fortress for you in Zuri right out in the open." Richard opened the binder and began sliding heavily redacted financial disclosures, corporate deeds, and voting proxy agreements across the desk. I looked down at the complex web of shell companies, blind trusts, and holding corporations. 3 years ago, Richard explained, leaning forward, your father hosted that disastrous Thanksgiving dinner. The one where he openly mocked your promotion to director of brand strategy, calling it a cute little hobby while demanding Jamal invest in your brother's failing shipping venture. You left the table in tears. Jamal sat in this exact office the very next morning. He told me he was done watching you be the family punching bag. He told me he was going to buy the ultimate leverage so they could never threaten your stability again. I felt a hard lump form in my throat. Jamal had held me that night in our kitchen, wiping my face and promising me that one day my family would answer to me. I had assumed it was just the sweet, comforting whisper of a protective husband. I had no idea he was formulating a corporate takeover. Jamal systematically liquidated his highest-performing tech stocks and quietly funneled the capital through a series of anonymous LLCs. Richard continued tracing a line on the flowchart with his silver pen. He used that untraceable capital to aggressively purchase majority voting shares in a commercial real estate conglomerate called Vanguard Holdings. The name hit me like a freight train. Vanguard Holdings was a titan in the Atlanta commercial property sector. They owned dozens of premium downtown office high-rises and sprawling industrial parks across the perimeter. They were notoriously ruthless landlords who catered exclusively to top-tier corporate clients. Why Vanguard? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper as I studied the stock certificates bearing my name as the sole beneficiary of the blind trust. Richard flipped to the last tab in the heavy binder. He pulled out 2 separate commercial lease agreements and laid them perfectly flat in front of me. Because Kendra Vanguard Holdings owns the 50-story glass tower on Peachtree Street, the exact same building where your father's prestigious law firm currently rents the entire 40th and 41st floors. The air in the room suddenly vanished. I stared at the lease agreement bearing my father's firm name. Calvin Williams derived his entire sense of superiority from that office. He boasted endlessly about the panoramic views, the mahogany lobby, the sheer prestige of occupying the most expensive commercial real estate in the city. He used that address to intimidate rivals and impress his wealthy clients. And Vanguard Holdings also owns the Southside Industrial Park, Richard added, tapping the second lease agreement. The 30,000 square foot warehouse facility that your brother Trey currently leases for his so-called expanding logistics company. I looked up at Richard, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs as the absolute magnitude of Jamal's strategy finally clicked into place. Jamal had not just secured my financial independence, he had literally bought the ground my abusers walked on. He had positioned me as the apex predator in their corporate ecosystem. As the majority shareholder of Vanguard Holdings, Richard stated, his tone deadly serious. You possess unilateral executive authority. You hold the controlling vote on the board of directors. You have the power to order sudden invasive financial audits of any commercial tenant to ensure they are complying with the strict morality and legal clauses embedded in their lease agreements. Clauses that dictate immediate eviction if a tenant is found conducting illicit activities on Vanguard property. My mind instantly flashed to the financial dossier I had dropped at Madison's feet just an hour ago. The undeniable proof that Trey was not expanding a legitimate shipping fleet, but was actively using his warehouses to funnel cash into offshore gambling syndicates. Trey was operating an illegal federal fraud scheme directly on Vanguard property. And my father, I realized the puzzle pieces snapping together with lethal precision. Calvin just embezzled $50,000 to cover Trey's gambling debts. He is scrambling to replace the funds before his firm's quarterly audit. Richard leaned back in his leather chair, a sharp, predatory smile spreading across his face. If the majority shareholder of Vanguard Holdings were to mandate an emergency landlord audit of Calvin's firm this afternoon, citing suspected financial irregularities, Richard said smoothly, your father's missing $50,000 would be discovered by the senior partners immediately. He would be disbarred, ruined, and likely facing federal charges before dinner. I sat perfectly still, absorbing the immense crushing weight of the power resting on the mahogany desk. For 35 years, I had allowed Calvin and Brenda to shrink me. I had swallowed their insults, accepted their dismissals, and allowed them to place Trey on a golden pedestal while I swept up his messes. They thought my husband's death was a prime opportunity to strip the meat from my bones. They thought they were dealing with a terrified, weeping widow who would surrender her last dollar just to maintain the illusion of family harmony. They had absolutely no idea that they were now standing in my house completely surrounded by gasoline, and I was holding the only match. I reached out and placed my hand firmly flat against the thick Vanguard Holdings binder. The leather was cool under my palm. I did not feel grief in that moment. I did not feel fear. I felt a profound, icy, absolute authority. Richard watched me closely. What is your first order of business, Madam Chairman? He asked, his voice ringing with profound respect. Before I could utter a single word, my cell phone resting on the edge of the desk began to vibrate aggressively. The screen lit up with a rapid-fire sequence of notifications. Then my smartwatch buzzed. Then the phone rang, entirely shattering the silence of the office. I glanced down at the screen. It was an incoming call from my Aunt Patrice, a woman who had not spoken to me in 3 years. I swiped to ignore the call, but the notifications continued to pour in like a digital avalanche. Text messages from distant cousins, voicemails from family friends, and alerts from social media platforms. I unlocked the screen and opened the first message from a cousin. It was a link to a newly published crowdfunding campaign. I clicked the link and felt my blood turn to absolute ice. Staring back at me was a massive, high-resolution photograph of my beautiful 6-year-old daughter, Zuri. Below her smiling face was a long, tragic paragraph soliciting immediate donations for emergency legal fees to fight a greedy, mentally unstable widow who was hoarding family wealth. My parents had launched a vicious public smear campaign framing me as a monster while using my dead child's face to collect cash. The revelation hit me with the force of a physical blow. I stared at the 2 commercial lease agreements resting on the immaculate mahogany desk, my eyes tracing the signatures of my father and my brother, Calvin Williams and Trey Williams. 2 men who had spent their entire lives treating me like a disposable accessory, a convenient scapegoat to bear the weight of their failures and inflate their massive, fragile egos. They had marched into my home while I was mourning the death of my child and my husband, demanding money, threatening my stability, and promising to leave me with absolutely nothing. They had done all of this while standing on a financial trapdoor that my husband had meticulously built beneath their feet. Jamal bought their buildings? I whispered the words, sounding surreal as they left my mouth. He bought the law firm. He bought the warehouses. He bought the leverage. Richard corrected, his sharp eyes glinting with a fierce protective pride. Jamal understood that men like Calvin and Trey only respect one language: power. They do not respond to logic, they do not respond to boundaries, and they certainly do not respond to emotional appeals. Your husband knew that the only way to permanently protect you was to control the environment in which they operate. He made you the apex predator of their corporate ecosystem. I slowly reached out and placed my fingertips against the cold, crisp paper of my father's lease agreement. Calvin's signature was bold and aggressive, taking up entirely too much space on the signature line. It was the exact same heavy-handed script that had signed away my college fund 10 years ago. As the majority shareholder, Richard continued, his voice taking on the precise, calculating cadence of a wartime strategist. You have absolute authority over Vanguard Holdings. The board answers to you. The property managers answer to you. You have the power to approve lease renewals, dictate rent increases, and enforce every single compliance clause embedded in those contracts. My mind immediately flashed to the confrontation in the lobby just an hour prior. Madison's hysterical weaponized tears. Her frantic, desperate wailing that Trey was having panic attacks in the bathroom because his business was starving. And then the undeniable, chilling realization of what Trey was actually doing with that business. I reached down to the floor next to my chair and lifted my black leather briefcase. I placed it on Richard's desk, snapped the gold clasps open, and pulled out the thick manila folder I had found hidden in Jamal's home office safe the night before. I had spent hours poring over the documents in the dark, my grief temporarily suspended by the sheer shock of what I was reading. Richard. I said, my voice completely steady as I opened the folder and turned it toward him. Trey is not expanding a logistics company. He does not have a fleet of delivery trucks, and he certainly does not need $50,000 for legitimate corporate expansion. Richard raised an eyebrow, adjusting his silver reading glasses as he looked down at the neatly organized stack of wire transfer receipts, shipping manifests, and offshore banking logs. Jamal was tracking him, I explained, tapping a heavily highlighted wire transfer document. My husband hired a private forensic investigator 3 months ago. Trey has been using the Southside Industrial Park warehouses to funnel cash into offshore gambling syndicates. He is running a massive illegal federal fraud scheme directly out of the facility he leases from Vanguard Holdings. Madison's luxury lifestyle, the designer clothes, the country club memberships, it is all built on a house of cards that is actively under federal scrutiny. Richard's eyes widened slightly as he scanned the documents, his mind rapidly processing the legal implications. The silence in the office was absolute, save for the soft ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the corner. And my father, I continued, the puzzle pieces locking together with a cold, terrifying clarity. Calvin demanded exactly $50,000 from Jamal's life insurance by Friday morning. He threatened to freeze my accounts if I did not wire the money immediately. He is not trying to help Trey expand a business. He is trying to cover Trey's tracks. Embezzlement, Richard murmured, looking up from the dossier, his sharp eyes meeting mine. Your father is a senior partner at a prestigious law firm. If Trey is in debt to offshore syndicates and Calvin needs $50,000 in untraceable cash by Friday, Calvin stole it from his own firm's escrow accounts. I finished, the reality of my father's arrogance finally making perfect sense. He assumed he could bully his grieving, vulnerable daughter into handing over the life insurance money to replace the stolen escrow funds before his firm conducts their end-of-month financial audit. He thought I was an easy mark. Richard leaned back in his leather chair, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across his face. He looked at the lease agreements, then at the forensic dossier, and finally at me. The dynamic in the room had fundamentally shifted. I was no longer a widow seeking legal protection from her abusive family. I was a corporate titan, armed with a nuclear arsenal, reviewing the coordinates for a targeted strike. Every commercial lease agreement executed by Vanguard Holdings contains a standard non-negotiable morality and legal compliance clause. Richard stated, his voice dropping into a low, lethal register. If a tenant is found to be conducting illicit or illegal activities on Vanguard property, the landlord has the unilateral right to mandate an immediate invasive emergency financial audit. Furthermore, the landlord possesses the right to execute an immediate zero-notice eviction, padlocking the doors and surrendering the premises to federal authorities. I looked down at the documents. For my entire life, my family had systematically dismantled my boundaries, gaslit my reality, and demanded my absolute subservience. They had skipped the funeral of my husband and my 6-year-old daughter to drink cocktails on a beach, only to return with fresh sunburns and their hands out ready to pick my bones clean. They had weaponized my grief, mocked my success, and assumed my silence was a permanent symptom of weakness. Jamal had seen the storm coming. He had spent 3 years building the fortress. He had bought the high-rise. He had bought the warehouses. He had handed me the keys to their entire existence. Richard, I said, my voice ringing with a cold, absolute authority that I had never heard before. I placed my hands flat on the mahogany desk, leaning forward until I was looking directly into the eyes of Jamal's most trusted advisor. I want you to draft the emergency audit notices for both the law firm and the logistics company. I want the forensic accounting teams mobilized by tomorrow morning, and I want the eviction paperwork finalized and ready for my signature. Richard did not hesitate. He picked up his silver pen and pulled a fresh legal pad toward him. It will be my absolute pleasure, Madam Chairman. The high-resolution photograph of Zuri staring back at me from the illuminated screen of my smartphone was taken on her 5th birthday. She was wearing a bright yellow sundress, laughing uncontrollably as Jamal spun her around in our sunlit backyard. It was a fiercely private, fiercely beautiful moment that I had cherished. Now my parents had slapped a bold red donation progress bar straight across the bottom of it. The campaign title read, "Help Save Our Family Legacy from a Greedy, Unstable Widow." I read the campaign description, my eyes tracking the absolute poison they had deliberately typed out for the entire world to see. They claimed Jamal and I had maliciously hidden assets for years. They claimed my grief had triggered a severe mental break, causing me to irrationally attack my own brother and freeze the family accounts out of pure spite. They painted themselves as the desperate, loving grandparents trying to protect their bloodline. They were begging for $100,000 in emergency legal fees to protect Trey's logistics business from my so-called vindictive hoarding. The sheer, unadulterated depravity of using my dead child's face to grift money from strangers triggered a physiological reaction in my body. The room seemed to tilt, but my hands remained perfectly still. The notification chime on my smartphone rang out again and again, a relentless digital assault that demanded my attention. I clicked on my voicemail inbox, watching the list of new messages scroll endlessly down the screen. The first message was from my Aunt Patrice, my father's oldest sister. She had not called me when Jamal died. She had not sent flowers. She had not attended the not sent flowers. She had not attended the funeral. But now her voice rang out through the tiny speaker, dripping with sanctimonious venom. "Kendra, I am absolutely disgusted by your behavior." Aunt Patrice's voice echoed loudly in the quiet, pristine space of Richard's office. "Your father called me in tears. How dare you disrespect your elders like this? You have always been a selfish, stubborn girl, but trying to bankrupt your own brother while he is trying to feed his children is a new low. You need to apologize to Calvin immediately and release those funds, or you are dead to this family. We will not stand by and let you ruin your father's good name." The next voicemail was from my Uncle Marcus, Calvin's younger brother. "You are an absolute disgrace to the Williams name, Kendra. Your father gave you everything. He put a roof over your head, and this is how you repay him, holding a dead man's money over your own blood. Fix this before God strikes you down. You are acting like a crazy person, and everyone can see it." Message after message poured in. Cousins I had not seen in a decade left scathing texts. Family friends who regularly attended Calvin's lavish summer barbecues flooded my social media with passive-aggressive comments. Church members who blindly worshipped at the altar of my father's carefully curated public image shared the GoFundMe page with prayers for Trey's salvation. They were all rallying behind the patriarch exactly as they had done for my entire life. This was Calvin's ultimate weapon. Whenever anyone dared to step out of line or question his absolute authority, he deployed his extended family as flying monkeys to shame, harass, and isolate the offender until they completely submitted. He had done this exact same thing when I refused to co-sign Trey's first catastrophic business loan right out of college. My extended family had bombarded my dorm room phone for weeks, calling me an ungrateful snob who thought she was better than her own flesh and blood just because she secured a full academic scholarship. They systematically broke me down, isolated me, and ridiculed my ambitions until I stopped answering my phone entirely. Calvin always used the weight of the community to crush any individual rebellion. But I was not a terrified 20-year-old college student anymore. I was a 35-year-old corporate strategist sitting in the executive office of the most ruthless estate attorney in Atlanta, staring directly at a corporate binder that gave me the legal power to literally dismantle their lives. I listened to one final voicemail. It was from my mother, Brenda. Her voice was sharp, breathless, and utterly devoid of any maternal affection. "You leave us no choice, Kendra," Brenda hissed, her tone laced with frantic, desperate panic. "You embarrassed Madison in public today. You threatened your father. We are going to expose you to everyone. We will tell your corporate firm about your mental instability. We will drag you through probate court until you have absolutely nothing left. Write the check to Trey by tomorrow morning, or I swear to you, we will make sure you never work in this city again." I did not cry. My tear ducts were entirely dry. The profound, suffocating grief that had weighed down my chest for weeks completely evaporated, instantly replaced by a brilliant, blinding clarity. The campaign using Zuri's face was the final definitive severing of whatever microscopic thread of biological loyalty still tied me to these people. They were not my family. They were a hostile infection, and I possessed the absolute cure. I calmly locked my smartphone screen, placing it face down on the polished mahogany desk. Richard Sterling sat perfectly still across from me, his hands steepled, his sharp, analytical eyes watching my face. He had heard the voicemails. He had seen the grotesque GoFundMe page. He did not offer empty platitudes or unsolicited advice. He understood the dynamic perfectly. He simply waited for my command. I reached across the desk and pulled the massive black leather Vanguard Holdings binder directly in front of me. I flipped past the complex asset disclosures and the corporate holding flowcharts, stopping at the heavily tabbed section containing the commercial lease agreements. "Richard," I said, my voice completely stripped of any human warmth, sounding like forged steel. "My father and my brother truly believe they are fighting a grieving widow over a $50,000 life insurance policy. They believe they can pressure me into submission by leveraging public opinion and extended family guilt. We are going to let them believe that right up until the exact second the floor falls out from under them." I placed my index finger heavily on the commercial lease agreement for Trey's Southside Industrial Park warehouses. "Trey's logistics company is an active front for offshore gambling syndicates," I stated, maintaining absolute unwavering eye contact with Richard. "He is operating a massive federal fraud scheme directly on my property. That is a direct fatal violation of the Vanguard Holdings commercial morality and legal compliance clause. I am not waiting for a lengthy court order. I am not waiting for an internal investigation." I slid the heavy document across the smooth wood toward Richard. "Draft a 30-day notice of immediate eviction for the entirety of Trey's warehouse facility," I commanded. "Cite the specific compliance violations regarding illicit financial activities. I want the formal notice served to him by a corporate process server at exactly 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. Simultaneously, I want federal marshals anonymously notified of the suspected illegal gambling operations occurring on the premises. Lock the facility gates. Cut the commercial power to the buildings. Seize all assets currently housed inside the warehouses to cover the maximum penalties for breaking the lease." Richard's pen flew across his legal pad, his face illuminated by a sharp, predatory grin. "It will be drafted and certified within the hour. The federal tip-off will ensure he cannot move a single piece of equipment or shred a single document before the marshals arrive. He will be locked out of his own fraud scheme." Now for Calvin, I said, flipping the heavy page to the master lease agreement for his prestigious law firm. My father derived his entire sense of superiority from occupying the 40th and 41st floors of the Vanguard Glass Tower. He used that high-rise address to intimidate his rivals and impress his wealthy elite clients. Calvin embezzled $50,000 from his firm's client escrow accounts to cover Trey's immediate offshore debts, I said, tracing Calvin's arrogant sweeping signature on the lease. He is actively relying on extorting me to replace those stolen funds before his senior partners notice the discrepancy during the end-of-month financial reconciliation. He thinks he has time to bully me into writing the check. I looked up at Richard, my jaw set. As the majority shareholder and primary landlord of Vanguard Holdings, I am exercising my unilateral right to demand a mandatory emergency corporate audit of the tenant, I instructed, measuring every word. Draft the official summons. I want the notice hand-delivered directly to the managing senior partners of Calvin's firm first thing tomorrow morning. The summons will explicitly state that Vanguard Holdings has received credible intelligence regarding severe financial irregularities on the premises, and we are exercising our right to protect the integrity of our building. Require the firm to produce fully reconciled escrow ledgers by close of business tomorrow. Richard stopped writing. He looked up at me, a profound, absolute respect glowing in his eyes. They will not be able to produce reconciled ledgers, Richard noted quietly, the absolute brilliance of the trap settling over the room. Calvin is missing $50,000. The senior partners will immediately launch an internal review upon receiving a landlord audit summons. Calvin will be exposed as an embezzler before noon. He will be unilaterally stripped of his partnership disbarred and likely facing severe criminal indictment by the end of the week. Exactly, I replied without a single ounce of hesitation. He told me he wanted to drag me through court. I am bringing the court directly to his desk. Richard moved swiftly. He pulled two pristine, highly official legal documents from his secure printing station, laying them carefully side by side in front of me. The immediate eviction notice for Trey, the emergency audit summons for Calvin's firm. I reached into the inner breast pocket of my blazer and pulled out a heavy gold Mont Blanc fountain pen. It was Jamal's favorite pen, the one he used to sign our marriage certificate. The exact same pen he used to sign the blind trust documents that secretly bought the ground my abusers walked on. I uncapped the pen. The cool metal felt perfect and familiar in my hand. I leaned forward and signed my name on the bottom of the eviction notice, authorizing the complete, absolute destruction of my brother's fraudulent empire. I moved my hand to the second document, pressing the nib to the paper and signing my name to authorize the public and professional execution of my father's career. I did not feel a shred of guilt. I did not feel a shadow of doubt or hesitation. As the dark ink dried on the thick paper, the toxic, heavy chains that my family had wrapped around my neck for my entire life shattered into dust. They had demanded a war. I had just initiated a boardroom massacre. The drive to Oakwood Memorial Park was usually a time for quiet reflection, a rare pocket of absolute silence where I could allow myself to briefly remove the heavy armor I wore for the rest of the world. The passenger seat of my car held a massive arrangement of fresh stargazer lilies. They were Jamal's favorite flowers. He used to buy them for me every year on our anniversary, claiming their bold, vibrant color matched my personality. Now I bought them for him and for our beautiful little girl, placing them carefully on the manicured grass that covered their resting place. I needed this moment of peace. I needed to stand quietly with my husband and my daughter before the ruthless machinery of Protocol Vanguard, officially initiated at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. I needed to ground myself in the love I had for them before the brutal corporate and legal slaughter of my biological family commenced. The cemetery was a sprawling historic property filled with ancient oak trees and winding cobblestone paths. It was designed to be a sanctuary for the living to mourn the dead without interruption. I parked my car near the wrought iron gates and walked slowly up the gentle incline toward the eastern ridge where Jamal and Zuri were buried side by side. The morning air was crisp and completely still, but as I crested the top of the hill, the sacred silence of the cemetery was violently shattered. Stand a little closer to the headstone tray. Look down. Try to look more devastated. The voice belonged to my father. It carried that familiar, booming, authoritative tone, completely oblivious to the solemnity of the environment. I stopped dead in my tracks, my hands tightening around the stems of the lilies. About 50 yards away, surrounding the pristine granite markers of my husband and my child, was a full-scale production. Calvin was standing with his arms crossed, directing a young man holding a professional digital camera and a heavy silver light reflector. Trey was kneeling in the freshly cut grass, wearing a pristine black designer suit that looked like it had been purchased specifically for this occasion. He had one hand resting possessively on Zuri's small headstone, his head bowed in a pose of perfectly manufactured sorrow. Brenda stood just off to the side, holding a lace handkerchief to her dry eyes, periodically offering the photographer suggestions on which angle captured her son's tragic profile the best. They had hired a professional photographer to stage a fake grieving session over the bodies of the family members they had completely abandoned. A cold, sickening wave of absolute revulsion washed over me. I remembered the notification that had popped up on my phone in Richard Sterling's office, the fraudulent GoFundMe page featuring Zuri's bright, smiling face. They were not just running a digital scam from the comfort of their living room. They had physically invaded the final resting place of my family to manufacture high-resolution marketing materials for their grift. They were using the literal graves of my husband and my 6-year-old daughter to crowdsource a bailout for Trey's illegal offshore gambling syndicate. I did not scream. The time for emotional outbursts was permanently over. The raw, visceral grief I felt was instantly transmuted into a hyper-focused, lethal rage. I dropped the bouquet of stargazer lilies onto the grass. I did not want them anywhere near the toxic spectacle unfolding ahead. I marched straight across the lawn, my heels sinking slightly into the soft earth. My approach was completely silent, but the sheer velocity of my movement caused the young photographer to glance up from his camera lens. He lowered the heavy device, a look of profound confusion crossing his face, as he watched a woman in a sharp corporate suit bearing down on them like a heat-seeking missile. Trey shifted his position on the grass, still staring at the ground. "Did you get that shot?" he asked, his voice dripping with impatience. "My knees are getting wet." I did not slow down. I walked directly past my mother, ignoring her sudden sharp gasp of surprise. I stepped right into the center of their staging area, raised my foot, and violently kicked the heavy metal tripod supporting the photographer's secondary lighting rig. The metal legs buckled instantly. The entire rig crashed hard onto the granite pathway separating the burial plots, the bulb shattering with a loud, sharp crack that echoed across the quiet cemetery. "Hey man, what the hell?" the photographer yelled, scrambling backward and clutching his primary camera against his chest. "Get off my husband's grave," I said, my voice dropping into a deadly quiet register that left absolutely no room for debate. "Pack your equipment and get off this property right now before I have you arrested for trespassing and desecrating a gravesite." The young man looked from me to Calvin, completely bewildered. "Mr. Williams, you said you had the permits for this location." "He lied to you," I snapped, keeping my eyes locked on the photographer. "I am the sole owner of these plots. You have exactly 30 seconds to vanish, or my next call is to the police." The photographer did not need to be told a third time. The terrifying predatory energy radiating from me was enough to send him scrambling to gather his broken tripod and light reflector. He practically ran down the hill toward his parked van, leaving my family completely exposed. Trey stood up, brushing the grass off the knees of his expensive suit. He looked deeply annoyed rather than embarrassed. Brenda let out a long, exasperated sigh, dropping the lace handkerchief into her designer handbag. She adjusted her silk scarf, looking at me as if I were an unruly child who had just interrupted an important adult conversation. "You always have to make a ridiculous scene," Kendra Brenda sneered, her face twisting in pure disdain. "We paid that photographer an exorbitant hourly rate to come all the way out here. You are completely out of control." I took a slow, deliberate step toward her, closing the distance until I could see the heavy layers of foundation attempting to hide her aging skin. You skipped the burial. I said the words landing like physical blows. You skipped your own granddaughter's funeral. You told me that putting them in the ground was a trivial event not worth missing your luxury vacation in St. Bart's. You would not stand in the freezing pouring rain to hold me while my world ended. But you will put on a designer suit and pose in the sunlight to beg strangers for cash. Calvin stepped forward, puffing out his chest, and attempting to use his physical size to intimidate me exactly as he had done in my living room 3 days ago. Watch your tone when you speak to your mother. Calvin barked, his booming voice completely shattering the peaceful atmosphere of the cemetery. We are doing what is necessary to protect the Williams family legacy. You forced our hand, Kendra. We gave you the opportunity to do the right thing and fund your brother's business. You chose to be selfish. You chose to be vindictive. Now we have to appeal to the community for help because you have clearly lost your mind. I looked from Calvin to Trey, who was now standing with his arms crossed, a smug, entitled smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. I saw the campaign, I said, my voice completely steady. I read the disgusting lies you typed under my daughter's photograph. You are telling the world that I am a mentally unstable widow hoarding generational wealth. You are soliciting $100,000 for emergency legal fees. Because it is the truth, Trey shot back, his tone dripping with unearned arrogance. You are unstable. You canceled our emergency credit cards out of pure spite. You locked us out of our own supplementary accounts. We have suppliers to pay, Kendra. We have vendors breathing down our necks. We need that operating capital immediately, or the logistics company goes under. The sheer audacity of his lie was staggering. He was standing on the grave of a man who knew exactly what kind of criminal he was, continuing to spin the myth of a legitimate business. You are not paying suppliers, Trey, I replied, my gaze locking onto his shifting eyes. You are not paying vendors. You are funneling cash into offshore gambling syndicates. You are running a massive federal fraud scheme, and you are using my dead child's face to crowdsource a bailout because your violent creditors are finally calling in your markers. Your luxury lifestyle is built entirely on federal wire fraud. Trey's smug smirk vanished instantly. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking pale and suddenly very sick. He glanced nervously at Calvin, who merely tightened his jaw, completely unfazed by the explicit mention of his son's criminal activities. Calvin knew. Calvin had always known. He was just too arrogant to believe I would ever possess the leverage to do anything about it. You do not know what you are talking about, Trey stammered, taking a half-step backward. You are completely delusional. Brenda stepped between us, her eyes flashing with pure, vicious hatred. She pointed a manicured finger directly at my face, her mask of the grieving grandmother entirely gone. You ruin everything, Kendra, Brenda snarled, her voice dripping with venom. You have always been a bitter, jealous little girl. Move aside. We are finishing this photo shoot whether you like it or not. If you are not going to fund your brother, the public will. We will collect every single dime we need, and we will make sure the entire city knows exactly what a greedy, miserable woman you are. I did not yell back. I did not flinch away from her pointing finger. I simply looked at the three of them standing together, a unified front of absolute toxicity and predatory greed. They were so consumed by their own arrogance that they felt completely invincible. They felt so safe in their superiority that they were willing to explicitly confess their intentions right out in the open. I slowly slid my right hand into the deep pocket of my trench coat. My fingers brushed against the smooth glass of my smartphone. I found the tactile button on the side of the device. It was a custom shortcut I had programmed specifically for interactions with my family after my first meeting with Richard Sterling. Without breaking eye contact with my mother, I pressed the button twice. A tiny, muffled vibration confirmed that the voice memo application had launched and was actively recording every single sound within a 20-foot radius. Let me make sure I understand you perfectly, Mom, I said, projecting my voice clearly to ensure the microphone picked up the audio. You are openly admitting to using a fraudulent GoFundMe campaign to solicit donations under false pretenses. You are admitting that the money is not for emergency legal fees, but to fund Trey's offshore debts. Calvin scoffed, waving his hand dismissively. Call it whatever you want, little girl, he sneered, leaning closer. We call it survival. We call it utilizing the resources available to us. The public loves a tragedy, and your husband's death is a very lucrative tragedy. We will raise that $100,000 by the end of the week, and there is absolutely nothing you can do to stop us. You do not have the power to shut us down. I smiled. It was a small, cold, chilling smile that caused Calvin to suddenly falter. I slid my hand out of my pocket, leaving the phone safely inside, continuing to record their brilliant, unforced confessions. You are right, Dad. I whispered, the absolute finality of my trap closing perfectly around them. I cannot stop you from posting pictures on the internet, but I can stop everything else. I turned my back on them, leaving them standing in the grass, completely confused by my sudden retreat. I walked back down the hill toward my car, my mind operating with the cold, ruthless efficiency of a machine. They wanted a public spectacle. They wanted to play the victims. Tomorrow morning, exactly at 9 o'clock, they were going to learn what true victimhood felt like. I had only made it halfway down the gentle slope of the cemetery hill when the heavy, frantic crunching of gravel sounded directly behind me. The footsteps were not measured or polite. They were the desperate, aggressive strides of a man completely losing his grip on reality. For my entire life, turning my back on Calvin Williams was the ultimate unpardonable sin. It was a direct challenge to his absolute authority, an act of defiance that always resulted in severe psychological punishment. He could not stand the fact that I was walking away from his manufactured spectacle without shedding a single tear or offering a single apology. Do not walk away from me when I am speaking to you, Kendra. My father bellowed, his voice carrying across the silent rows of granite headstones. I did not stop walking. I kept my eyes focused straight ahead on my parked car, feeling the cold, smooth weight of my smartphone resting inside my coat pocket, still actively recording every single breath he took. Suddenly, a massive, heavy hand clamped down violently on my left bicep. Calvin yanked me backward with a brutal, terrifying force that sent a sharp spike of pain radiating through my shoulder. The sudden momentum forced me to spin around my low heels, sliding against the damp grass. He stood towering over me, his chest heaving, his perfectly tailored suit jacket pulling tight across his broad shoulders. His face was an ugly mottled shade of crimson, and the veins in his thick neck were pulsing visibly against his white collar. You think you are so brilliant, do you not? Calvin snarled, his grip tightening on my arm like a vice. You think because you sit in some fancy corporate office you are suddenly untouchable. You think you can just dismiss me. You think you can stand there with that icy, unbothered look on your face and deny your own flesh and blood the money we need. I looked down at his massive hand gripping my coat sleeve, and then slowly raised my eyes to meet his furious gaze. I did not struggle against his hold. I did not wince. I simply stared at him with an expression of complete, absolute emptiness. The terrified little girl who used to flinch at his shadow was dead and buried. Take your hand off me, Dad, I said, my voice dropping into a deadly quiet register. Calvin let out a sharp, vicious laugh that sounded more like a bark. His massive ego, completely shattered by my utter lack of fear, took total control of his rational mind. He needed to crush my defiance. He needed to prove that he was the smartest, most powerful person in the world, and that I was nothing more than a pawn in his grand strategy. He leaned in so close I could smell the stale coffee and aggressive, expensive cologne radiating from his skin. You have no idea what is actually happening here, do you? Calvin hissed, a sickening note of triumph entering his voice. You think this is just about Trey being a little short on cash? You think we took that trip to St. Bart's just to sip margaritas on a beach? You are so utterly blind, Kendra. That luxury vacation was not a holiday. It was an airtight federal alibi. I remained perfectly still, letting the silence draw the poison straight out of his mouth. The voice memo application in my pocket continued to run, capturing the crisp, clear audio of a senior law partner initiating his own spectacular downfall. Trey did not just take out a bad business loan. Calvin continued his grip on my arm, tightening further as he reveled in his own perceived brilliance. Your idiot brother got himself in deep with an offshore sports betting syndicate operating out of the Caymans. He owes $50,000 to people who do not send collection letters, Kendra. They send people to break legs. They send people to burn down houses. We needed to wire the money internationally to clear his markers, but we could not leave a digital footprint tying the transaction to our local accounts. He leaned closer, his eyes wide and manic with adrenaline. We needed stamped passports showing we were entirely out of the country when the offshore accounts settled. Calvin bragged, his voice vibrating with a monstrous pride. We established a perfect international alibi. While you were weeping over caskets in the mud, we were securing the survival of this family's legacy. And the $50,000 I asked, keeping my tone perfectly flat, deliberately prompting him to continue digging his own grave. Where did you get the capital if Trey is bankrupt and your accounts are locked? Calvin smiled, an ugly, predatory sneer that fully exposed the rotting core of his morality. I am a senior partner at the most prestigious real estate law firm in Atlanta, Calvin whispered, his voice thick with arrogance. My firm handles hundreds of millions of dollars in client escrow accounts every single quarter. Moving $50,000 out of a dormant commercial holding account is nothing but shifting a few numbers on a digital ledger. It is completely invisible. I routed the capital through a shell company directly into Trey's offshore account. I saved your brother's life while you were busy playing the grieving widow. You embezzled client funds, I stated, stating the fact clearly and cleanly for the hidden microphone. You stole $50,000 from your own law firm to pay off illegal gambling debts. It is only stealing if you cannot put it back before the books are closed. Calvin snapped aggressively, shaking my arm. The firm conducts a mandatory quarterly financial audit at the end of the month. I have exactly 3 weeks to replace the missing capital before the senior accounting partners reconcile the escrow ledgers. That is why you are going to write that check today, Kendra. You are going to sign over Jamal's life insurance payout to cover the gap. You are going to replace the money I borrowed, and you are going to do it without asking another damn question. I looked at the man who had sired me. He was standing on sacred ground surrounded by the graves of the dead, openly confessing to multiple federal felonies, simply because his fragile ego could not handle the fact that I was not crying. He was so accustomed to total obedience that he felt entirely comfortable handing me the blueprint to his own destruction. And if I refuse, I asked, my voice steady and cold, what if I let your firm discover the missing funds during their quarterly audit? Calvin's face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated malice. He released his grip on my arm and took a step back, crossing his arms over his chest. If you do not wire that money to my account by tomorrow morning, I will go directly to the authorities myself, Calvin threatened, his voice echoing with absolute vicious conviction. I will walk into the federal prosecutor's office and I will hand them a heavily doctored paper trail proving that Jamal was the primary architect of Trey's offshore gambling ring. My breath caught in my throat. The sheer demonic evil of his threat struck me like a physical blow to the chest. I am a senior law partner, Kendra, Calvin sneered, stepping back into my personal space. I know exactly how to fabricate emails. I know how to forge digital signatures. I will create a flawless narrative that shows your perfect, brilliant husband was using his venture capital firm to launder dirty money for violent criminals. I will tell the police that Jamal's car crash was not a tragic accident. I will tell them he was fleeing from syndicate enforcers. I will drag your dead husband's name through the mud until his entire corporate legacy is synonymous with federal fraud. Your daughter's memory will be tied to a disgraced criminal. He smiled, a wide, terrifying display of teeth. Pay up, Kendra, Calvin whispered, or I swear to God I will destroy the only thing you have left to hold on to. The silence that followed his threat was absolute. The wind swept through the ancient oak trees above us, rustling the autumn leaves. Calvin stood there waiting for the inevitable collapse. He waited for my shoulders to slump. He waited for the tears to fall. He waited for me to pull out my checkbook and surrender everything I had, just to protect my husband's honor. Instead, I raised my hand and grabbed Calvin's thick wrist. With a sudden violent twist born of pure adrenaline and 35 years of suppressed rage, I effortlessly broke his grip on my coat. I shoved his arm away with such intense physical force that Calvin stumbled backward, his expensive leather shoes slipping awkwardly on the damp gravel path. I reached into the deep pocket of my trench coat and pulled out my smartphone. The screen was brightly illuminated, showing the active voice memo application. The digital timer read exactly 14 minutes and 22 seconds. I looked Calvin dead in the eyes and pressed the bright red stop button. The soft chime of the recording saving to the cloud echoed sharply between us. Calvin's arrogant smirk instantly vanished. His eyes darted down to the phone in my hand and then back up to my face. The realization of what had just happened slammed into him with the force of a speeding train. The blood completely drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. His jaw dropped open, but no sound emerged. "You should not worry about the quarterly audit at the end of the month, Dad," I whispered, leaning forward until I was just inches from his terrified face. I slipped the phone securely back into my pocket, my eyes completely devoid of mercy. "You should worry about the emergency landlord audit," I continued, my voice slicing through the morning air like a newly sharpened blade. "The one I ordered this morning. The one that starts at your firm in exactly 1 hour." Calvin did not say another word. He turned on his heel and sprinted across the damp cemetery grass toward his parked Mercedes. He completely ignored Brenda screaming his name and Trey demanding to know what was happening. He threw himself into the driver's seat, slamming the door shut and peeling out of the parking lot. The heavy tires tore up the gravel as he sped toward the highway. His hands gripped the leather steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He reached for his dashboard console, rapidly dialing his junior partner, David. The line rang endlessly before David finally answered, his voice hushed and frantic. Calvin barked his orders, demanding David immediately lock down the escrow ledgers and deny entry to any third-party auditors. David stammered that it was too late. The auditors were already inside the building, backed by Vanguard Holdings corporate security personnel. Calvin ended the call, a cold, sickening sweat breaking out across his forehead. He swerved through the Atlanta morning traffic, breaking every speed limit, his massive ego refusing to accept that he had been outplayed. He was Calvin Williams. He had built his entire career destroying weaker opponents. He would simply walk into his firm, pull rank, threaten a few jobs, and squash this ridiculous rebellion. He convinced himself that Kendra was just throwing a tantrum and that her supposed audit was a bluff. He abandoned his Mercedes in the executive loading zone of the 50-story glass tower, tossing his keys at the terrified valet without breaking his stride. He marched through the towering marble lobby, flashing his senior partner badge at the security turnstiles. The elevator ride to the 41st floor felt like an eternity. He straightened his silk tie, wiping the sweat from his brow, composing his face into the mask of the untouchable legal titan. The elevator doors parted. The reception area was entirely silent. The usual hum of ringing phones and chattering paralegals was completely gone. The receptionist stared down at her desk, refusing to make eye contact, as Calvin stormed past her. He headed straight for the executive boardroom at the end of the hall. He could see silhouettes through the frosted glass double doors. Calvin grabbed the heavy brass handles and shoved the double doors open with maximum force, intending to command the room through sheer physical intimidation. The heavy doors slammed against the walls. He stepped inside, opening his mouth to issue a barrage of furious threats, but the words instantly died in his throat. The expansive mahogany table was completely occupied. Every single senior partner of the firm was seated. Their faces were grim, their arms crossed tightly over their chests. Stationed along the perimeter of the room were 5 forensic accountants in sharp gray suits, actively extracting data from the firm's central servers via encrypted laptops. Standing quietly by the floor-to-ceiling windows were 2 plainclothes police detectives, their gold badges clearly visible on their belts. Sitting at the very head of the mahogany table, occupying the seat specifically reserved for the firm's managing director, was me. I was wearing a pristine white tailored suit, projecting absolute, unwavering authority. I did not look like the shattered widow he had left at the cemetery. I looked like the executioner, My hands were folded neatly on the polished wood. A small black remote control rested directly next to my right hand. Calvin's mind fractured trying to process the visual. Pushed to the absolute brink by my icy, unbothered demeanor, his massive ego took over. He fell back on his only remaining weapon, volume and condescension. He forced a booming, arrogant laugh that echoed hollowly off the glass walls, using his deep voice to assert dominance over the room. "What is this nonsense?" Calvin demanded, pointing a thick finger at me. "Get my daughter out of my boardroom. She is going through a severe mental crisis and has absolutely no business being on these premises. Security should never have let her pass the lobby. This is a private corporate facility." I did not argue with him. I did not raise my voice. I simply picked up the small black remote control and pressed a single button. The massive high-definition projector screen behind me hummed to life, descending from the ceiling. A crystal-clear document flashed onto the bright screen. It was the master deed of ownership for the Vanguard Holdings glass tower, displayed perfectly alongside the corporate documentation listing my name as the sole controlling shareholder and executive chairman. The senior partners turned their heads, looking from the screen to Calvin with absolute unmasked disgust. One of the managing partners, a man named Arthur who had worked with Calvin for 20 years, stood up. Arthur placed a thick stack of printed financial logs onto the center of the table. "You do not own this boardroom," Calvin Arthur stated, his voice practically vibrating with anger. "Vanguard Holdings owns this boardroom. Vanguard Holdings owns this building. And Madam Chairman Williams has just provided us with undeniable proof that you have committed egregious felonies using our corporate escrow accounts." Calvin stared at the projector screen, his mouth opening and closing. He looked at me, his eyes darting frantically, searching for the submissive, terrified daughter he had bullied his entire life. He found absolutely nothing. "The emergency audit began exactly 45 minutes ago," I announced, my voice echoing with surgical precision. "The forensic team bypassed your local passwords and went straight into the central mainframe. They have already located the $50,000 discrepancy in the client escrow ledger. They have also isolated the exact IP address and timestamp of the unauthorized offshore wire transfer you executed on Tuesday morning." Calvin's chest heaved. He looked at the two police detectives who were now stepping forward from the windows. He realized his entire career, his freedom, his wealth, and his legacy were evaporating in real time. His survival instinct kicked in, overriding whatever microscopic shred of paternal loyalty he possessed. "It was Trey," Calvin shouted, pointing a trembling finger blindly toward the hallway. "My son Trey was in terrible trouble with violent offshore syndicates. He begged me for help. He threatened to harm himself if I did not secure the funds. I only moved the money temporarily to save his life. I was going to replace every single cent tomorrow morning. I am a victim of my son's criminal enterprise. You have to believe me." The room erupted in disgusted murmurs. A father throwing his own son to the wolves to save his own skin. It was the ultimate display of Calvin's cowardice. Arthur shook his head, leaning heavily against the mahogany table. "Do not insult our intelligence, Calvin. You stole client funds. You violated your fiduciary duty. You broke federal law. You have single-handedly destroyed the reputation of this firm. We convened an emergency equity vote 5 minutes before you burst through those doors. You are hereby stripped of your partnership. Your equity shares are seized to cover the immediate financial liability, and your legal license is effectively suspended pending the Bar Association's review." "You cannot do this to me!" Calvin roared, slamming his fists down onto the polished wood. "I built this firm. I brought in the biggest clients in the city. You need me. I am Calvin Williams. You built your career on bullying people who were too terrified to fight back," I replied, cutting through his hysterical shouting. "You built your wealth on intimidation, but you made a fatal miscalculation, Dad. You assumed Jamal's wealth was unguarded. You assumed my grief made me weak. You assumed you could use my dead husband's name as a shield for your own crimes." I reached into my pocket and placed my smartphone on the table. I tapped the screen, playing the crystal-clear audio recording I had captured at the cemetery just an hour earlier. Calvin's own arrogant voice filled the boardroom, openly confessing to the embezzlement, bragging about his fake St. Bart's alibi, and viciously threatening to frame Jamal for Trey's offshore gambling syndicate. The two detectives exchanged a look. The senior detective stepped forward, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from the back of his belt. The metallic clinking sound was the loudest noise in the room. Calvin Williams, the detective, said, his voice completely devoid of emotion. "You are under arrest for grand larceny, embezzlement, and federal wire fraud. Put your hands behind your back." Calvin stumbled away from the table, his back hitting the glass wall of the boardroom. He looked at the partners he had worked alongside for decades. They all turned their heads, refusing to look at him. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a pathetic, desperate terror. "Kendra, please." Calvin begged, his booming, authoritative voice reduced to a pathetic, whimpering rasp. "I am your father. I gave you life. Please call them off. I will do whatever you want. I will give you whatever you ask for. Just please do not let them take me away in handcuffs." I stood up from the executive chair, smoothing the crisp fabric of my white suit. I walked around the massive mahogany table, stopping just out of arm's reach. I looked at the man who had tormented me for 35 years. The man who had called me a failure. The man who had tried to steal from my dead husband. The man who had watched my mother and brother tear me down and applauded them for it. "You told me that failures do not belong in the Williams family," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. "You told me that power is the only language that matters. I am simply speaking your language, Calvin. You are a liability. You are a criminal. And you are officially evicted from my building." The detective stepped forward, grabbing Calvin by the arms and spinning him around. The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs locking around his wrists echoed through the boardroom like a judge's gavel. Calvin sobbed a loud, ugly sound as they marched him out of the room and down the hallway. I turned to the forensic accountants, who were still typing rapidly on their laptops. "Send the complete unredacted audit files directly to the district attorney's office," I commanded. "I want every single digital footprint attached to that $50,000 transfer documented and legally verified." Arthur approached me, his posture radiating profound respect and a healthy dose of fear. "Madam Chairman, we deeply apologize for the actions of our former partner. We had absolutely no idea he was engaged in illicit activities. We are fully cooperating with the authorities and the forensic teams. I will review your firm's updated compliance protocols next week, Arthur," I replied, picking up the black remote control in my smartphone. "Ensure this never happens again, or Vanguard Holdings will terminate your commercial lease permanently." I walked out of the boardroom, leaving the stunned executives behind. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a notification from Richard Sterling. The eviction at the Southside Industrial Park had been successfully executed. Federal marshals had raided Trey's warehouses, seizing his assets and permanently shutting down his illegal operation. My brother and my father had been completely neutralized in a single morning. But there was still one person left who needed to learn exactly who she was dealing with. I pulled out my phone and dialed my mother's number. I stepped away from the head of the table and walked directly toward the integrated media console built into the mahogany wall paneling. Calvin watched my movements, his chest heaving, his eyes darting frantically between my hands, the impassive faces of the plainclothes police detectives, and the disgusted glares of his senior partners. He was hyperventilating the pristine facade of the untouchable legal titan, rapidly dissolving into the terrified posture of a cornered animal. I pulled a standard auxiliary cable from the media dock and plugged it directly into the port on my smartphone. I did not break eye contact with my father as my finger hovered over the screen. I wanted him to see the absolute absence of hesitation in my eyes. I wanted him to understand that the frightened, submissive daughter he had bullied and manipulated for 35 years was entirely gone, replaced by the architect of his total ruin. I tapped the screen. The firm's state-of-the-art surround sound system, a network of premium speakers, normally reserved for international teleconferences, and multi-million-dollar corporate pitch decks, hummed to life. Calvin's own booming, arrogant voice rained down from the ceiling, filling the expansive boardroom with terrifying, unavoidable clarity. The crisp audio from the cemetery cut through the sterile corporate air, exposing the rotting core of his character to the exact people he had spent decades trying to impress. The senior partners sat frozen in their leather chairs, utterly paralyzed as they listened to Calvin explicitly admit to embezzling $50,000 from their secure client escrow accounts. They heard him brag about the mechanics of the theft, detailing how easily he manipulated the firm's digital ledgers to funnel untraceable cash to a shell company. They heard him gleefully explain that his luxury vacation to St. Bart's was not a holiday, but a premeditated, airtight federal alibi to protect himself while he paid off violent offshore gambling syndicates. Then came the final fatal blow. The audio captured Calvin's vicious, unhinged threat to frame my dead husband. His voice echoed off the glass walls, promising to doctor financial paper trails and lie to federal prosecutors to paint Jamal as the mastermind behind Trey's illegal betting ring. I watched Arthur, the managing partner, close his eyes and slowly shake his head. The color had completely drained from Arthur's face. The sheer scale of the liability Calvin had just exposed the firm to was catastrophic. The forensic accountants standing along the perimeter of the room stopped typing on their encrypted laptops, staring at Calvin in absolute disbelief. I reached out and disconnected the cable. The sudden silence in the boardroom was deafening, heavier and more suffocating than the audio itself. "You have destroyed us," Arthur whispered, his voice trembling with a potent mixture of rage and profound betrayal. "You stole from our clients, Calvin. You used our infrastructure to fund organized crime, and you planned to frame an innocent deceased man to cover your tracks. You are a monster." Calvin's mind fractured completely. He looked around the room, frantically searching for a single sympathetic face, a single partner willing to offer him the benefit of the doubt. He found absolutely nothing but disgust. The realization of his absolute ruin slammed into him, shattering his massive ego into 1,000 irreparable pieces. The firm he had built, the wealth he had hoarded, the reputation he had curated, it was all permanently incinerated. He did the only things a coward could do when entirely stripped of his power. He ran. Calvin spun around his expensive leather dress shoes, slipping awkwardly against the polished hardwood floor. He lunged toward the secondary exit at the rear of the boardroom, a private door that led to the executive lounge. It was a pathetic, desperate scramble, the uncoordinated flight of a man completely devoid of dignity. He did not even make it 3 steps. The 2 plainclothes detectives moved with brutal, practiced efficiency. The senior detective intercepted Calvin, grabbing him by the shoulder of his tailored suit jacket and driving him hard against the heavy mahogany wall paneling. The impact rattled the framed corporate degrees hanging nearby. Calvin let out a sharp, breathless gasp as the air was forced from his lungs. "Calvin Williams, you are under arrest," the detective stated, his voice devoid of any emotion, projecting the cold, clinical authority of the law. The second detective grabbed Calvin's wrists, twisting his arms behind his back with zero gentleness. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting tightly around Calvin's wrists echoed through the silent boardroom. It was the sound of ultimate finality. "You have the right to remain silent," the senior detective continued, reciting the Miranda warning as he spun Calvin around to face the room. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you." Calvin was weeping. Hot, ugly tears streamed down his face, ruining his perfectly groomed appearance. His chest heaved with hysterical sobs. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a frantic, pathetic desperation. "Kendra, please," Calvin begged, his booming voice reduced to a wet, miserable rasp. "I am your father. Please tell them to stop. I will give the money back. I will sign whatever you want. Just do not let them do this to me." I stood perfectly still, my hands resting at my sides. I looked at the man in handcuffs and felt absolutely nothing. No pity, no remorse, no lingering familial obligation. "You made your choice at the cemetery, Dad," I replied, my voice ringing with icy, absolute authority. "You chose to protect a criminal over your own daughter. You chose your ego over my husband's memory. You do not get to demand mercy after you have exhausted your ammunition." Arthur stood up from the table, adjusting his suit jacket. He looked at the detectives, then at Calvin. "Take him out of my sight," Arthur commanded, his tone dripping with revulsion. "Calvin, Your equity in this firm is immediately seized to cover the damages you have caused. Your partnership is permanently terminated. If you ever set foot on these premises again, I will have you charged with criminal trespassing. You are nothing to us." The detectives gripped Calvin by his biceps and began frog-marching him toward the primary glass doors of the boardroom. Calvin's head hung in absolute defeat, his sobbing echoing pathetically in the quiet space. He was entirely stripped of his title, his dignity, and his freedom in a matter of minutes. Just as the detective reached out to push the heavy glass doors open, they burst violently inward. The doors slammed loudly against the stops, causing everyone in the boardroom to jump. Standing in the threshold was Trey. He looked entirely unrecognizable. His pristine black designer suit, the same one he had worn for the fake performative photo shoot at the cemetery, was ruined. The jacket was torn at the shoulder, and his white dress shirt was drenched in sweat clinging to his chest. His tie was missing. He was hyperventilating, pulling in desperate, ragged gasps of air, his eyes wide and bloodshot with sheer, unadulterated terror. Trey froze in the doorway. His wild, panicked eyes darted across the room. He saw the forensic accountants securing the servers. He saw Arthur and the senior partners glaring at him. He saw the two police detectives standing at attention, and then his gaze locked onto his father. He stared at the heavy steel handcuffs binding Calvin's wrists behind his back. Finally, Trey's eyes moved to the head of the mahogany table, landing directly on me. I stood there immaculate and unbothered, the architect of their total destruction, holding the keys to the very building they were standing in. Trey burst through the glass doors, his breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps. The pristine black designer suit he had worn to mock my dead husband and daughter at the cemetery just 2 hours ago was entirely ruined. The shoulder seam was torn, likely from a physical altercation with federal agents, and a massive sweat stain soaked through his expensive white dress shirt. He was hyperventilating, his eyes wide and unfocused. The most revealing part of his entrance was not his physical deterioration. It was his complete, utter blindness to anyone else's suffering. Trey walked right past Arthur and the senior partners. He completely ignored the forensic accountants. He brushed directly past the two plainclothes police detectives. He did not even spare a single glance for Calvin, his own father, who was standing against the wall with his hands locked in heavy steel cuffs, weeping in total humiliation. The golden child was entirely consumed by his own catastrophe. He ran straight to the head of the mahogany table, stopping just inches from where I stood. "Kendra," Trey gasped, slamming his hands down on the polished wood, his voice a frantic, high-pitched whine. "They locked me out. The feds. There were black SUVs everywhere. Federal marshals just padlocked my warehouses. They seized the delivery trucks. They seized the servers. The property management company showed up with armed security and changed the gate codes while I was standing right there." Calvin let out a strangled, pathetic groan from the corner of the room, attempting to shuffle toward his son. "Trey," Calvin croaked, holding out his handcuffed wrists. "Trey, look at me." Trey violently shoved his father's handcuffed hands away without even looking at him. "Shut up, Dad. Not right now." Trey kept his wild eyes locked entirely on me. "Kendra, you have to help me. The property manager said the eviction came directly from the majority shareholder of Vanguard Holdings. They said someone tipped off the feds about the offshore accounts. You have contacts in commercial real estate. You know people in the financial district. You have to call whoever owns Vanguard and tell them it is a misunderstanding. I need that operating capital." I looked at my older brother. For 35 years, Calvin and Brenda had placed him on a golden pedestal. They had celebrated his mediocre achievements, funded his reckless ventures, and demanded that I shrink myself so Trey could feel large. They had trained him to believe that his actions had no consequences, and that whenever he made a mess, I would be forced to clean it up. He truly believed that even after desecrating my family's gravesite, he could simply demand my resources to save his illicit empire. I stood up perfectly straight, smoothing the lapels of my white suit. I reached down to the desk, picking up the thick black leather binder. "I do not need to make a phone call to Vanguard Holdings, Trey," I said, my voice projecting a cold, absolute calm that seemed to lower the temperature in the entire boardroom. "Because I do not just have contacts at Vanguard. I am Vanguard. Trey blinked, his brain entirely unable to process the words I was speaking. He stared at me, a blank, stupid expression washing over his sweating face. What are you talking about? As the sole majority shareholder and executive chairman of Vanguard Holdings, I stated, pronouncing each syllable with lethal precision. I personally terminated your commercial lease agreement this morning. The termination was executed due to your direct involvement in illegal gambling operations conducted on my commercial property. Furthermore, the federal marshals did not show up by accident. They were highly interested in the forensic financial dossier I handed over to them. The silence in the boardroom was absolute. The detectives watched with sharp professional interest. The senior partners stood paralyzed. You, Trey whispered, the blood draining from his face as the magnitude of his destruction finally registered. You tipped off the feds. You bought my buildings. My husband bought your buildings. I corrected, my voice ringing with the fierce protective authority of a woman who had finally claimed her power. Jamal spent 3 years quietly purchasing the ground you walk on because he knew exactly what kind of parasites you and Calvin were. He secured my absolute financial dominance while you were busy playing a successful businessman with stolen money. I opened the black leather binder and pulled out the crisp certified copy of his 30-day eviction notice. It bore my bold, unmistakable signature at the bottom. I held it out, pressing the heavy paper directly against Trey's sweating chest. Family invests in family, Trey, I said, repeating the exact manipulative phrase Calvin had used for decades to extort money from me. Consider this my ultimate investment in your reality. Trey did not take the paper. It fluttered from my fingers, landing face up on the mahogany table. His legs simply gave out. The golden child, the untouchable prince of the Williams family, dropped heavily to his knees right in the middle of the corporate boardroom. He wrapped his arms around his stomach, buried his face in the carpet, and began weeping loudly, wailing like a terrified, broken child. Before the echoes of his sobbing could settle, the sharp melodic chime of the executive elevator rang out from the hallway. The rapid, frantic clicking of designer stilettos striking the marble floor grew louder, echoing down the corridor. The heavy glass boardroom doors were still pushed wide open from Trey's violent entrance. Madison burst into the room. She was wearing a pristine white tennis outfit, a massive diamond tennis bracelet glittering on her wrist, and oversized designer sunglasses pushed back into her perfectly highlighted blonde hair. She was clutching her smartphone like a lifeline, her manicured fingers trembling violently. "Trey!" Madison gasped, her voice shrill and panicked. "Trey, what is going on? Your text messages made no sense. My credit cards just declined at the country club. The bank said our primary accounts are frozen pending a federal investigation." She stopped abruptly, her eyes scanning the horrific tableau inside the boardroom. She saw the forensic accountants dismantling the firm's servers. She saw Calvin, the terrifying patriarch who had always funded her luxury lifestyle, standing against the wall in steel handcuffs, his face stained with tears. And then she looked down at the floor where her husband was curled into a fetal position, weeping uncontrollably over a piece of eviction paperwork. Trey lifted his head, his face red and swollen. "Maddie," he sobbed, reaching a shaking hand toward her. "Maddie, she took everything. Kendra took the business. The feds took the accounts. We have nothing left." I watched Madison closely. For 6 years she had paraded around family events, treating me like the hired help. She had constantly made passive-aggressive comments about my modest lifestyle, my career, and my marriage to Jamal. Just yesterday, she had stood in my lobby crying weaponized tears, demanding my husband's life insurance money to maintain her country club status. I waited to see if she would drop to the floor and comfort her devastated husband. I waited to see if the sacred vows of marriage meant anything to a woman whose entire identity was built on financial transaction. Madison's survival instincts kicked in with breathtaking, ruthless speed. She completely ignored Trey's outstretched hand. She stepped right over his legs, bypassing her weeping husband entirely, and walked directly to the head of the mahogany table. She stopped right in front of me, her blue eyes wide, frantic, and entirely devoid of loyalty. Madison reached out and grabbed both of my hands, squeezing my fingers tightly. "Kendra, please," Madison begged, her voice dropping into a rapid, desperate whisper. "You have to listen to me. I had absolutely nothing to do with the offshore gambling. I told Trey it was a stupid idea. I told him he was going to ruin us. I will give you everything. Trey stopped crying. He lifted his head from the carpet, staring at his wife in total, uncomprehending shock. Maddie, what are you doing? He croaked. Madison did not even look back at him. She kept her frantic gaze locked entirely on me. I will testify against them. Madison promised, her words tumbling out in a rush of pure self-preservation. I will testify against Trey. I will testify against Calvin. I know where the secondary ledgers are hidden. I have the master passwords to Trey's offshore Cayman accounts. I can give the federal prosecutors the names of every single syndicate contact Trey met with in Miami last month. I will give you every piece of evidence you need to bury them both. The absolute silence in the boardroom returned heavier and more toxic than before. Calvin stared at his daughter-in-law, his jaw slack. Trey looked as though he had just been stabbed in the chest. I will cooperate fully, Madison pleaded, squeezing my hands tighter, tears welling in her eyes. Just please, Kendra, please let me keep the house. Let me keep the cars. Do not let them seize my personal assets. I will give you whatever you want. I looked at this woman, this hollow, transactional creature who had married into my family for the sole purpose of elevating her social status. She was willing to feed her husband and her father-in-law directly to the federal government in exchange for a zip code and a luxury vehicle. She was the ultimate manifestation of everything Calvin had built his legacy upon: greed, betrayal, absolute moral bankruptcy. I looked down at her perfectly manicured hands gripping mine. I felt a profound physical revulsion rise in my throat. I slowly and deliberately pulled my hands away from her grip, stepping back to create a hard, impenetrable boundary between us. I looked at her with a level of absolute disgust that caused her to physically shrink backward. I do not make deals with parasites, I said, my voice echoing clearly off the glass walls. Your house was purchased with stolen funds. Your cars were leased with fraudulent capital. The federal government will seize every single thing you own, and you can offer your passwords to the prosecuting attorney when they indict you for conspiracy. Madison gasped, her face crumbling into a mask of pure panic. I did not waste another second of my breath on her. I looked past Madison, raising my hand and signaling the two massive Vanguard Holdings corporate security officers standing out in the reception area. Gentlemen, I commanded, projecting my voice down the hallway. These two individuals are no longer permitted on Vanguard property. Throw them out onto the street. If they attempt to re-enter the building, call the police. The security guards moved immediately, their heavy boots thudding against the marble floor. They marched into the boardroom, grabbing Trey by the arms and hauling him roughly to his feet. Trey did not resist. He hung limply between the two massive guards, completely broken. The second guard grabbed Madison by the elbow, ignoring her sudden hysterical shrieking as she realized her country club life was permanently extinguished. I stood at the head of the table and watched as my brother and his wife were forcibly removed from my building, their desperate cries fading down the hallway as the elevator doors closed behind them. I turned my attention back to the senior partners and the detectives, the absolute silence returning to the room. The slaughter was complete. Calvin's face instantly drained of all color, leaving his skin a sickly, translucent shade of gray. The arrogant, predatory smirk that had defined his features for my entire life completely evaporated. The realization that I had successfully outmaneuvered him struck with the devastating force of a physical blow. He stood frozen amidst the damp gravel of the cemetery, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly as his mind desperately scrambled to comprehend the magnitude of the disaster I had just unleashed upon him. He did not look back at my mother, who was still clutching her ruined designer dress and sobbing into her hands. He did not say a single word to Trey, who was loudly whining about his frozen bank accounts and demanding immediate answers. Calvin simply turned on his heel and broke into a frantic dead sprint toward the parking lot. The sight of a senior law partner in a bespoke suit fleeing a graveyard was profoundly pathetic, but I watched him go with absolute chilling satisfaction. He threw himself into the driver's seat of his imported black Mercedes, slamming the heavy door shut and gunning the engine with reckless aggression. The tires spun violently, kicking up wet grass and loose gravel as he tore out of the cemetery gates. His massive hands gripped the leather steering wheel with white-knuckled desperation as he sped toward the highway. He snatched his smartphone from the center console and began dialing frantically. He called Arthur, the firm's primary managing partner, but the call went straight to an automated voicemail. He called his executive assistant, a woman who had faithfully managed his schedule for a decade, but there was no answer. He called the head of the firm's internal accounting department. The line rang endlessly before a terrified junior clerk finally picked up the receiver. Calvin barked his orders, demanding the immediate lockdown of the escrow ledgers and the absolute denial of entry to any third-party auditors under the threat of immediate termination. The clerk stammered that it was too late. The auditors were already inside the building, backed by the property management's elite corporate security personnel, and had seized control of the central servers. Calvin hurled the phone against the passenger seat, a cold, sickening sweat breaking out across his forehead. He merged onto the bustling Atlanta highway, weaving dangerously through the morning traffic and breaking every posted speed limit. His fragile ego simply refused to accept his defeat. He convinced himself that he could still control the narrative. He was Calvin Williams. He was the most feared real estate litigator in the entire city. He had built his formidable career by destroying weaker opponents, burying his mistakes, and manipulating the truth. He would simply walk into his firm pull rank, threaten a few jobs, and completely squash this ridiculous rebellion. He rationalized that my emergency audit was just a dramatic bluff, an emotional tantrum thrown by a grieving widow who did not understand how corporate power actually worked. He abandoned his vehicle in the executive loading zone of the 50-story glass tower, tossing his keys at a startled valet without breaking his rapid, aggressive stride. He marched through the towering marble lobby of the Vanguard Holdings building, flashing his senior partner badge at the security turnstiles with his usual entitled arrogance. The elevator ride to the 41st floor felt like an agonizing eternity. The digital floor numbers ticked upward, mocking his mounting anxiety. He straightened his silk tie, wiping the cold sweat from his brow, and violently forced his face into the familiar mask of the untouchable legal titan. He needed to project absolute authority. He needed to remind everyone in that building exactly who paid their lucrative salaries. The elevator doors parted with a soft melodic chime. The reception area, which was normally a hive of corporate activity, was entirely silent. The usual chaotic hum of ringing phones, typing paralegals, and bustling junior associates was completely gone. The receptionist, a young woman who typically greeted him with a bright, subservient smile, stared intently down at her desk, absolutely refusing to make eye contact as Calvin stormed past her station. The silence was thick and oppressive, hanging in the air like a storm cloud ready to burst. He headed straight for the executive boardroom at the far end of the hallway, his expensive shoes thudding heavily against the plush carpet. He could see sharp, dark silhouettes moving behind the frosted glass double doors. Calvin grabbed the heavy brass handles and shoved the double doors open with maximum aggressive force. He fully intended to command the room through sheer physical intimidation, just as he had done to me my entire life. The heavy doors slammed against the interior walls with a loud, echoing crack that made several people flinch. He stepped inside, opening his mouth to issue a barrage of furious career-ending threats, but the words instantly died in his throat. The expansive mahogany table was completely occupied. Every single senior partner of the firm was seated in their high-backed leather chairs. Their faces were uniformly grim, their arms crossed tightly over their chests in a collective display of severe judgment. None of them offered him a greeting. None of them stood up out of respect. Stationed along the perimeter of the room were 5 forensic accountants in sharp gray suits. They were actively extracting massive amounts of financial data from the firm's central servers via heavy encrypted laptops with thick cables running directly into the wall ports. Standing quietly by the floor-to-ceiling windows, their postures relaxed but highly alert, were 2 plainclothes police detectives. Their gold shields were clearly visible, clipped to their leather belts, resting right next to their service weapons. Sitting at the very head of the mahogany table occupying the oversized leather seat specifically reserved for the firm's managing director was me. I was wearing a pristine tailored white suit projecting absolute unwavering authority. I did not look like the shattered mourning widow he had left standing in the mud at the cemetery. I looked exactly like the executioner. My hands were folded neatly on the polished wood. A small black remote control rested directly next to my right hand. Calvin's mind fractured completely trying to process the visual reality in front of him. Seeing me sitting in the seat of supreme power, surrounded by the very men he considered his peers, pushed him to the absolute brink of his sanity. His massive, fragile ego took over, completely overriding his basic survival instincts. He fell back on his only remaining weapon, which was volume and aggressive condescension. He needed to diminish me. He needed to prove to his silent judging partners that I was nothing more than an emotional little girl playing dress-up in a serious corporate environment. He forced a booming, arrogant laugh that echoed hollowly off the glass walls. He puffed out his chest, using his deep, resonant voice to assert dominance over the boardroom. "What is this nonsense?" Calvin demanded, pointing a thick, accusatory finger directly at my face. "Get my daughter out of my boardroom immediately. She is going through a severe mental crisis regarding her husband's tragic death and has absolutely no business being on these premises. Corporate security should never have let her pass the front lobby. This is a private commercial facility." I did not argue with him. I did not raise my voice or defend my mental state. I did not offer him a single shred of the emotional reaction he so desperately craved. I simply maintained my dead-even stare, picked up the small black remote control, and pressed a single button. The massive high-definition projector screen behind me hummed to life, smoothly descending from the ceiling. A crystal-clear document flashed onto the bright screen, illuminating the darkened room. It was the master deed of ownership for the entire 50-story glass tower, displayed perfectly alongside the corporate legal documentation listing my name as the sole controlling shareholder and executive chairman of Vanguard Holdings, the very entity that served as the primary landlord for his prestigious law firm. Jamal had spent the last 3 years quietly acquiring the commercial real estate that housed my father's business, ensuring that if Calvin ever attempted to cross us, we would literally own the ground beneath his feet. The trap was not just sprung, it was flawlessly executed. The torrential downpour battered the thick bulletproof glass of my study windows with a relentless rhythmic fury. The storm had rolled over the city just past midnight, turning the streets into rushing rivers of black water and reflecting the harsh yellow glare of the street lamps. I stood in the center of the quiet, dimly lit room, holding a warm mug of herbal tea, completely insulated from the freezing chaos outside. My new estate was a fortress of limestone and steel, tucked securely behind massive wrought iron gates and towering ancient oak trees. It was a place built for absolute peace, a sanctuary designed to keep the world exactly where it belonged. On the far wall, the high-definition security monitor glowed with a sharp, pale light. I stared at the live feed from the primary gate camera. Standing on the other side of the heavy iron bars, fully exposed to the violent, lashing rain, was my mother. Brenda was entirely unrecognizable. The impeccably groomed country club matriarch, who had spent her entire life judging the financial status of her neighbors, was completely gone. Her expensive salon blonde hair was plastered flat against her skull, dripping murky water down her face. Her makeup was ruined, running in thick black streaks down her cheeks and settling into the deep, terrified lines around her mouth. She was not wearing designer silk or imported cashmere. She was wearing a cheap, thin raincoat that offered absolutely no protection against the freezing downpour. In her trembling hands, she clutched a single black plastic trash bag, holding the pathetic remnants of her completely shattered life. Over the past 4 weeks, the absolute devastation of the Williams family had been executed with surgical, merciless precision. Trey had completely buckled under the weight of the federal raid. His offshore accounts were seized, his warehouses were padlocked, and he was currently sitting in a federal detention center, facing decades in prison for racketeering and wire fraud. Madison, staying true to her parasitic nature, had filed for a vicious, expedited divorce. The very same afternoon, Trey was arrested attempting to legally sever herself from his financial ruin and secure whatever microscopic assets the government had not already frozen. Calvin had fared even worse. The brilliant, untouchable legal titan had been denied bail, entirely deemed a flight risk due to his offshore connections. His law firm had completely disavowed him cooperating fully with the federal prosecutors to ensure their own survival. To pay back the massive sums he had embezzled, every single one of Calvin's assets had been aggressively liquidated. His luxury cars were repossessed. His investment portfolios were drained. The sprawling suburban mansion that Brenda had treated as her personal royal palace had been seized and auctioned off by the banks, leaving her entirely destitute, with absolutely nowhere to go and no one to manipulate. The security intercom on my desk buzzed a harsh electronic sound that sliced through the quiet ambiance of my study. I set my mug down on the polished wood. I walked over to the console and looked closely at the screen. Brenda was staring directly into the camera lens, shivering violently, her shoulders hunched against the biting cold. Kendra. Brenda wept, her voice crackling through the external microphone, raw and desperate. Kendra, please let me in. It is freezing out here. I have nowhere else to go. The banks took the house. They took the accounts. Your father left me with nothing. I am your mother, Kendra. Please open the gates. I listened to her pathetic whimpering, recognizing the exact same manipulative cadence she had used my entire life. There was no apology in her voice. There was no genuine remorse for the decades of psychological torture she had inflicted upon me. There was no regret for standing by while Calvin threatened to frame my dead husband. She was not crying because she had lost her daughter. She was crying because she had lost her comfortable, luxurious lifestyle, and she desperately needed a new host to attach herself to. I reached out and pressed my finger against the heavy silver intercom button. I am listening, I said, my voice perfectly steady and devoid of any emotional warmth. Brenda let out a loud, dramatic sob, leaning her wet face against the cold iron bars of the gate. Oh, thank God, Kendra. Thank God you answered. Please just let me come inside. We can fix this. We can start over. I know things got out of hand, but we are still family. You have to help me. Blood is thicker than water, Kendra. Family invests in family. I stared at her through the digital feed, watching the rain wash away the very last traces of her manufactured dignity. She was relying on the biological guilt she had programmed into me since childhood. She fully expected me to crack, to feel a surge of pity for the shivering woman in the storm, to open my doors and invite the poison right back into my bloodstream. I pressed the intercom button down firmly. You called the burial of my husband and my daughter a trivial event. I stated, my voice cutting through the storm with the sharp, cold finality of an executioner's blade. You stood over their graves and complained about the mud on your shoes. You told me my grief was an inconvenience. My family is buried in the ground. You are just a stranger trespassing on my property. Brenda gasped, her eyes widening in absolute horror as the realization finally crashed down upon her. She opened her mouth to scream, to beg, to hurl a final barrage of desperate insults, but I did not give her the chance. I pulled my finger off the button and reached over to the master control panel. With a single definitive motion, I cut the power to the external audio feed. Total silence instantly returned to the study. I walked away from the console, moving toward the expansive bay window that overlooked the front of the estate. The storm raged outside, lightning flashing across the dark sky, illuminating the manicured grounds in sudden, jagged bursts of white light. Down below, at the heavy wrought iron gates, a black SUV with tinted windows rolled to a smooth stop. The estate's private security team stepped out into the rain, holding large black umbrellas. They were highly trained professionals, moving with a calm, clinical efficiency. I watched through the thick glass as they approached Brenda. They did not use violence. They did not yell or act with aggression. They simply treated her exactly as I had commanded, like a trespasser, like an unwanted nuisance, like garbage that needed to be removed from the property line. Brenda dropped to her knees in the mud, wailing silently behind the soundproof glass, clutching her pathetic trash bag to her chest. The security guards reached down, lifting her up by her arms and firmly escorting her away from the gates, steering her down the long, dark road leading back into the city. I stood by the window and watched until Brenda was completely swallowed by the storm and the shadows. She was gone. The generational curse was finally permanently broken. The next morning broke with breathtaking clarity. The violent storm had completely passed over the city, leaving behind a brilliant, vibrant blue sky. The air smelled incredibly fresh, washed clean of all the dirt and debris from the night before. The morning sun poured down over the estate, casting a warm, golden glow across the wet grass and the sparkling stone pathways. I stepped out onto the sprawling balcony extending from the master suite. I was not wearing the sharp, tailored white suit I had worn to wage war in the corporate boardroom. I was wearing a soft, oversized cashmere sweater and comfortable linen trousers. I held a steaming mug of dark roast coffee, letting the heat seep into my palms. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the crisp morning air, feeling a profound, absolute sense of peace settling deeply into my bones. I looked out over the expansive grounds of my fortress. In the very center of the estate, surrounded by ancient oak trees and perfectly manicured hedges, was a massive, beautiful community garden. It was a thriving, vibrant sanctuary of life and color. Thick clusters of blooming hydrangeas, brilliant yellow sunflowers, and rich purple lavender stretched across the soil. At the entrance to the garden, two heavy bronze plaques glinted brightly in the morning sun, proudly bearing the names of the people who mattered most: Jamal and Zuri. The sound of laughter floated up to the balcony, catching my attention. It was not the sharp, toxic, mocking laughter that had haunted my childhood. It was not the sound of a golden child tearing down his sister to elevate his own fragile ego. It was the sound of pure, genuine joy. Down below on the wide stone patio overlooking the gardens, my true chosen family was gathering. I saw Richard Sterling, my brilliant and ruthless attorney, standing by the patio tables, laughing loudly as he poured fresh coffee for the Vanguard Holdings executive team. I saw the loyal colleagues who had stood by my side during the darkest hours of my grief, the people who respected my leadership and shared my vision for the future. They were setting up platters of fresh food and arranging chairs in the warm sunlight. And walking up the main pathway entering the gardens with bright, eager smiles were 30 young African American students. They were carrying heavy backpacks and talking excitedly amongst themselves, their voices ringing with ambition and hope. They were the very first class of brilliant minds receiving full-ride college scholarships entirely funded by the newly established Zuri Vanguard Foundation. They were future engineers, future doctors, future architects, and future leaders. They were the living, breathing legacy of my daughter's name. Jamal's immense wealth was no longer a dormant asset, hoarded in a corporate bank account. It was actively changing the world, pouring light and opportunity into the next generation. I leaned against the stone railing of the balcony, taking a slow sip of my coffee. I smiled a deep, genuine smile that reached all the way to my eyes. I thought about Calvin sitting in a cold, concrete federal holding cell, entirely stripped of the power and prestige he had valued above all else. I thought about Trey facing decades behind bars, a ruined, bankrupt coward, completely abandoned by the superficial wife he had chosen. I thought about Brenda wandering the rain-soaked streets, a bitter, destitute ghost, completely erased from my reality. They had spent their entire lives trying to convince me that I was small. They had demanded that I break myself into pieces to accommodate their monstrous egos. They had assumed that my silence was a symptom of weakness, and that my grief was a vulnerability they could easily exploit. They had been spectacularly, fatally wrong. The golden child was ruined. The toxic parents were completely erased. The scapegoat was untouchable. I turned my face upward, closing my eyes, and letting the warm golden sunlight wash over my skin. I listened to the beautiful sound of my chosen family laughing in the gardens below. I had survived the darkest depths of sorrow and betrayal, and I had built an absolute empire of love, security, and legacy. I was safe. I was whole. And for the first time in my entire life, I was completely free. The most profound lesson from these stories is that your true worth is never defined by those who constantly belittle you, even if they are your own family. Toxic dynamics and cruel comparisons can easily break your spirit if you continually seek external validation. True strength comes from recognizing your own value, walking away from abusive environments, and building an independent life on your own terms. Shared blood does not automatically guarantee loyalty or unconditional love. You have the absolute right to set firm boundaries and fiercely protect your peace today. Please share your own survival story with us below.